It was late September of 2018 when I decided to go camping alone in the northern woods of Montana, near a small lake called Hartswell. I was 28 at the time, and I had been going through a stressful period with work, so I thought a quiet weekend in nature might help me clear my mind. I had camped before, though never completely alone. The idea of silence, the kind that stretched for miles, sounded peaceful to me back then. I didn't realize how heavy silence could actually feel until I was surrounded by it. I reached the campsite around 4 in the evening after driving a few hours from town. The dirt road leading there was rough and narrow, with thick trees pressing close on both sides. The forest was so dense that even in daylight it looked darker than it should have. I parked my car in a small clearing near the lake, unpacked my gear, and set up my tent near the tree line. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the only sounds I could hear were the faint buzz of insects and the slow slapping of water against the shore. After setting up, I collected some dry wood for a fire. The forest floor was littered with fallen branches, and the deeper I went into the woods, the quieter it became. There were no bird sounds, no wind moving through the leaves, just the sound of my own steps crushing dry twigs. That stillness made me oddly nervous, but I told myself it was just because I wasn't used to being alone in a place like this. By dusk, I had the fire going and cooked a small meal. I sat by the flames as the sky turned dark purple and the temperature began to drop. The light from the fire flickered across the trees, and I found myself staring into the darkness between them, half expecting something to move. The woods seemed endless, and the firelight didn't reach far enough to show what was out there. The deeper the night got, the more aware I became of every sound. Cracking branches, rustling leaves, even faint footsteps that could have easily been an animal. When I went to sleep that night, I kept my flashlight next to me. The fabric of the tent did little to block the sounds outside. Every snap or rustle seemed too close. I told myself it was just deer moving around, but it didn't stop the unease from growing in my chest. At one point, I heard something that didn't sound like an animal at all. A slow, dragging sound moving along the ground. I held my breath, staring at the shadowed ceiling of my tent, but eventually the sound stopped. I didn't sleep much after that. In the morning, the forest looked normal again. The fog hung low over the lake, and sunlight came through the branches in long beams. I tried to shake off the feeling from the night before. I made coffee on my small stove and decided to hike along the ridge to the west side of the lake. The air was cold and still, and the trail was covered in fallen leaves. About an hour into the hike, I noticed something strange. A small area where the trees had been cut down in a rough circle. The stumps looked fresh, the wood pale and splintered. There were no tracks, no signs of equipment, and no reason anyone would clear trees in the middle of nowhere. I didn't stay long there. Something about it felt wrong, like it wasn't supposed to be seen. I continued hiking until the afternoon, when I decided to turn back. On my way down, I started feeling like I wasn't alone. It wasn't a sound that made me feel that way, it was a sort of pressure, like eyes on me. I would stop and listen, but the forest stayed completely silent. The only time I caught something different was when I heard a faint snapping sound behind me. But when I turned, there was nothing. Kept happening, though. Every few minutes, a sound behind me, and every time I looked, the woods were empty. I began walking faster, my heart thudding harder each time I heard that crunch of leaves. By the time I reached the lake again, the sun was already lowering, and the shadows had stretched long across the water. That night, I built the fire bigger than before. The woods looked darker now, almost black, and I didn't like how quiet everything had become. Even the insects had gone still. As I sat by the fire, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. Footprints near my tent. They were faint, but the shape was clear enough. They weren't mine. They were from boots, large ones, and they led from the woods straight to the tent and back out again. I stared at them for a long time, trying to make sense of it. Maybe a hunter had passed by earlier, I thought. Maybe they had been there before I arrived. But I had checked that ground yesterday, and I knew they hadn't been. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing things moving just outside the firelight. Once, I heard something that sounded like a breath, heavy and close. I didn't move. I just stared at the faint outline of the tent ceiling and waited for it to pass. When I finally opened my eyes in the morning, the fire was dead, and there were fresh footprints again, this time leading right up to the spot where I had been sleeping. That was enough for me. I decided I would pack up and leave right after breakfast. I moved fast, my hands shaking as I stuffed gear into my bag. Every sound in the woods made me stop and look around. I didn't see anyone, but I felt watched the entire time. When I finally loaded the last of my stuff into the car, I looked once more at the treeline. There was movement, something standing just between the trees, not far from where I had pitched my tent. It was a man, or at least the shape of one. He was standing still, watching me. I could see the outline of his jacket, maybe his face, though it was hard to tell with the shadow of the trees covering him. I didn't wait to find out more. I started the car and drove out of there as fast as the dirt road allowed. My heart didn't slow down until I reached the main highway. Later that evening, I stopped at a gas station about 50 miles away. When I got out of the car, I noticed something that froze me completely. On the back window, near the bottom of the glass, there was a faint, smeared handprint. It was large, and it hadn't been there before. It looked like someone had pressed their hand against the window while it was dusty, dragging their fingers downward. I stood there staring at it, my stomach tight, realizing that maybe whoever had been near my tent that night had gotten a lot closer than I ever thought. I wiped it away and didn't look back at the woods again. I never went camping alone after that. I still remember that trip like it was yesterday, even though it happened almost 10 years ago. It was the summer of 2015. I was 27, and I had decided to go camping alone in a remote part of the Sawtooth Mountains in Idaho. I'd done plenty of camping before, but this time I wanted something quieter, more isolated. No trails packed with other people. Just me, the forest, and whatever nature threw my way. I left the small town of Stanley early in the morning, driving my old Jeep deep into the backcountry on a dirt road barely wide enough for one vehicle. The sky was clear, the air cool but not cold, and I felt a kind of freedom I hadn't felt in a while. I had my gear packed tight. A sturdy tent, a sleeping bag, enough food and water for 3 days, a portable stove, a decent knife, a headlamp, and a small first aid kit. I was confident and ready. After about 2 hours, I found a spot that looked perfect. A little clearing surrounded by tall pine trees, with a small creek running nearby. The ground was flat, covered in soft pine needles, and far enough from the road to be peaceful, but close enough to hear the faint sound of passing cars now and then. I set up my tent near the creek, careful to pitch it so the wind wouldn't blow straight into it. By mid-afternoon, I had everything ready and decided to explore a bit. I followed the creek upstream, stepping over rocks and ducking under low branches. The forest was thick but not so dense that I felt trapped. Birds chirped in the distance. A squirrel darted past me, disappearing up a tree. The sunlight filtered through the branches, casting long shadows on the forest floor. On the way back to camp, I noticed something odd. Fresh footprints in the soft mud near the creek. They were big, too big for a deer or any normal animal I knew. I knelt down to examine them. The prints looked like they belonged to a large boot, maybe someone hiking in heavy gear, but I hadn't seen anyone on the trail. It was strange but not necessarily alarming. People do hike around here after all. That evening, I built a small fire, cooking some freeze-dried meals while watching the flames crackle. The temperature dropped quickly as the sun set, and the forest grew darker and quieter. I kept the fire alive as long as I could, knowing it might help keep animals away. When it was finally too cold to stay outside, I crawled into my sleeping bag inside the tent. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly. My headlamp had died earlier, and I was completely in the dark. At first, I thought I heard something outside. Maybe the wind or an animal moving through the underbrush. But then I realized the sound was different. It was slow, deliberate footsteps, crunching softly on the pine needles just outside my tent. My heart started pounding. I froze. The noise stopped for a moment, then resumed, this time moving slowly around the tent. I grabbed my flashlight from the pocket of my sleeping bag and flicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there, just shadows and trees. I tried to tell myself it was probably a deer or some other animal, but the footsteps were too heavy and steady for that. And why circle the tent? My mind raced with possibilities. Someone could be watching me, maybe even stalking me. The thought made my skin crawl. I stayed as quiet as possible, gripping my knife in one hand and shining the flashlight around every few seconds. After what felt like forever, the footsteps finally stopped. Then, there was a faint rustling sound, like someone moving away through the bushes. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Every noise seemed louder. Every crack of a twig made me jump. By dawn, I was exhausted but relieved to see the first light of morning. The next day, I stayed close to camp, packing my gear just in case. I didn't want to stay here any longer than I had to. While checking around the tent, I found more footprints near the edge of the clearing. They looked the same as the ones by the creek, big, heavy boots and recent. I gathered my things quickly and started heading back the way I had come. I wanted to get to the road and find help if I needed it. As I walked, I kept looking behind me, feeling like something was following or watching from the trees. The forest that had seemed peaceful the day before felt threatening now. About halfway back to the road, I heard a low growl behind me. I stopped cold. Slowly, I turned around, shining my flashlight into the trees. Nothing, just the empty woods. But the growl came again, this time closer and more intense. It wasn't a wolf or a bear. It was something else, heavier and more menacing. I broke into a run, heart hammering, scrambling through the brush and over rocks. The growling faded but never fully disappeared. When I finally reached the dirt road, I looked back once more. No sign of anything. I didn't stop running until I reached my Jeep. I locked the doors and sat inside, trying to catch my breath. My hands shook as I started the engine and drove back towards Stanley. On the way, I thought about what I'd experienced. The footprints, the footsteps outside the tent, the growling. It wasn't wildlife as I knew it. Someone else was out there, and they weren't friendly. Later, I learned from locals that the area had been used by hunters and sometimes illegal campers. There had been warnings about people who didn't like strangers in the woods, and stories of dangerous encounters. I realized I had accidentally camped right where someone else might be living rough or guarding a secret spot. That trip changed how I thought about camping. I never went completely alone again, and I always checked in with locals before heading out. The forest wasn't just trees and animals. It was also home to people with their own rules and dangers. Looking back now, I'm thankful I made it out safe. I never saw who was making those footsteps or the growling sounds, but I knew enough to get away. That experience stayed with me, a reminder that the wild is not just nature. It's full of life in all forms, and sometimes that life wants to keep its distance. I decided to take a solo camping trip deep in the Bitterroot Mountains of Montana during late September 2012. I was 25 at the time, an amateur outdoorsman who wanted to test his survival skills away from the distractions of the city. The air was already starting to turn crisp, the early signs of fall hinting at colder nights ahead. I chose a spot near a small, clear stream that twisted quietly through a thick patch of pine and fir trees. It felt remote enough, far from any trailheads or signs of human life. I arrived late afternoon, carrying a heavy backpack filled with the essentials: a tent, sleeping bag, a small stove, some canned food, water, a first aid kit, and a good knife. I didn't want to carry too much, but I wanted to be prepared. The forest was dense, the canopy above filtering golden sunlight onto the mossy forest floor. I spent an hour setting up the tent in a small clearing next to the stream. The ground was soft but firm, perfect for sleeping. I gathered firewood nearby, selecting dry sticks and some larger logs for the night fire. It wasn't cold yet, but I knew it would drop below freezing once the sun went down. After the sun sank behind the mountains, I lit the fire with a match. The crackling flames and smoky scent filled the chilly air, and I sat close, warming my hands. I cooked some canned beans and rice over the fire, the smell making me hungrier than I expected. Once the meal was done, I cleaned up as best I could and settled into my sleeping bag inside the tent. The sounds of the forest all around me, the occasional rustle of leaves, the chirp of crickets, and the gentle flow of the stream were my lullabies. The night felt long and cold. Around midnight, I woke to a strange noise, something outside the tent, close but not quite right. At first, I thought it was just the wind shifting branches or an animal moving about. But the noise repeated, a slow, heavy crunch of footsteps on dry leaves and twigs, deliberately paced. I froze, heart pounding, eyes wide in the darkness. I listened carefully, trying to make sense of it. The footsteps circled my tent, slow and steady, then stopped just on the other side. My mind raced. Bears were a real threat in these parts, but usually they made more chaotic noises. This was different, too careful, almost like someone or something was watching me. I didn't have a gun, just a small knife, and the thought of a person out here at night made me uneasy. I stayed as still as possible, trying not to breathe loud enough to give away my position. After a few minutes, the footsteps moved away, crunching through the leaves, then faded into the dark woods. I wanted to stay calm, telling myself it was probably a deer or some other animal, but something felt off. I pulled out my small flashlight and shone it through the tent mesh, scanning the darkness. Nothing but black shadows and trees. I debated whether to pack up and leave, but the thought of moving around in the dark, possibly into danger, scared me more. The next morning, I found something that chilled me. Around my tent on the soft forest floor were footprints, large human footprints with heavy boots. They circled my tent in a perfect ring, almost like someone was trying to scare me or mark their territory. But the prints weren't just outside the tent. Some led right up to the edge of my camp, near the fire pit, and then stopped abruptly. There were no signs of anyone else camping nearby, no trash, no equipment. I packed up quickly, feeling the weight of unease settling deep in my chest. I decided to hike back the way I came, sticking to the marked trail this time, even though it was longer. The forest felt different, colder somehow. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching me. About 2 hours into my hike, I came across something else that made my skin crawl. Near the trail, not far from a bend, were more footprints, similar to the ones around my tent, but these were fresh. They led off the trail and deeper into a thick patch of brush. Next to the footprints was a small pile of broken branches and crushed leaves, like someone had been hiding or waiting. My mind jumped to the worst possibilities. Was this person living here? Were they watching me for days? I slowed down but didn't stop. I kept moving forward, my eyes scanning for movement. There was no one in sight, but the feeling of being followed was overwhelming. When I finally made it back to my car parked at the trailhead, I noticed the back window was smashed in. Shards of glass scattered across the ground. A loud, violent break that hadn't been there before. My heart sank. Inside the car, my backpack was still there, but my food supplies were gone, along with my pocket knife. Whoever had been near my camp had found the trail, found me, and rifled through my things. There were no other signs of theft, no money or valuables missing, but the message was clear. Someone had been watching, and they weren't just curious. I locked the car doors and sat for a long moment, shaking. I realized how vulnerable I had been out there, how little I had protected myself against something that wasn't a bear or a wild animal, but a person with unknown intentions. The wilderness might seem peaceful, but it hides dangers we can't always see. I reported the break-in to the park rangers that day, and they told me there had been recent reports of illegal campers and poachers in the area, people living off the grid, sometimes aggressive when caught. I never went back to that part of the Bitterroot Mountains. The experience taught me that sometimes the scariest thing in the woods isn't nature itself. It's the people who choose to live hidden in it, watching, waiting, and ready to cross the line. Looking back, I'm glad I stayed calm and didn't panic that night. I could have made worse mistakes, like running blindly into the dark or shouting to scare someone off. Instead, I kept quiet, stayed alert, and trusted my instincts. But the memory of those footsteps circling my tent, the feeling of unseen eyes in the dark, stays with me. It's a reminder that even in the most beautiful places, we need to respect the wild and be aware of the dangers that aren't always obvious. I had been planning this camping trip for months. It was late September of 2017, and I wanted to get away from the city noise, away from everything, for at least a few days. I chose a spot deep in the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia, far from the main trails and any kind of cell phone reception. The idea was to be alone with nature, to test my survival skills, and to find some peace in the wilderness. I arrived at the trailhead early afternoon, carrying a pack that felt heavier than I expected, filled with food, water, and my basic camping gear. A small tent, a sleeping bag, a portable stove, and a few tools. The weather was cool but clear, the air crisp and dry. The path into the woods was narrow, covered in fallen leaves, and the sun filtered through the trees in long streaks of orange light. I walked for about 3 hours, making good time, until I found a small clearing near a creek. The place was perfect. Flat ground, a gentle breeze, and the sound of running water nearby. I set up my tent with some effort. The wind had picked up slightly, and then gathered wood for a fire. I was careful to build the fire pit away from the tent, surrounded by stones. The woods were quiet except for the rustling of leaves and occasional bird calls. I cooked a simple meal of canned beans and rice on my stove and ate while watching the fire. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped quickly. I put on my jacket and sat close to the fire, watching the flames dance and listening to the night sounds. I knew the forest was home to animals. Deer, raccoons, maybe even bears, but I felt prepared. I had read about how to keep food stored safely and how to avoid attracting wildlife. I checked my watch. 9:15 p.m. The sky was clear, stars bright, and the moon was just a sliver. I decided to turn in early because I wanted to hike more the next day. I brushed my teeth with cold creek water and crawled into my sleeping bag inside the tent. I zipped it up tight to keep the cold out. The night was silent at first, but then I started to hear noises. At first, it was subtle. Twigs snapping in the distance, leaves rustling just beyond the clearing. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the wind or animals moving around. But the sounds grew closer, more deliberate. There was a low, dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across the ground. I stayed very still, holding my breath, eyes wide open in the dark. The tent fabric shivered as a sudden gust blew through. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow and steady, circling the clearing. The fire outside had almost died down to glowing embers, so I grabbed my flashlight and shone it outside. At first, I couldn't see anything except the tall trees and the shadows they cast. Then, about 15 feet away, I spotted a large figure moving between the trunks. It wasn't an animal I recognized. It was too tall to be a deer or a bear and walked upright. My heart pounded, and I felt a cold sweat run down my back. I grabbed my pocket knife, the only weapon I had. I thought about screaming or running, but I stayed frozen, not sure what to do. The figure stopped, and for a moment, I caught a glimpse of a man's face, dirty and worn, eyes sharp and hard. He was watching me. Suddenly, the fire flared up again, and the figure retreated into the woods, disappearing like a shadow swallowed by the trees. I didn't sleep the rest of the night, listening to every sound and gripping my knife tightly. The next morning, I woke early, the sky just starting to brighten. My tent flap had some small scratches, and a few footprints circled the clearing in the mud, fresh and deep. Whoever had been there was heavy and careful, not a random hiker. I packed quickly and decided to leave immediately. On the trail back, I kept looking over my shoulder. The woods felt different, heavier somehow, not the peaceful place I had come to enjoy. I walked faster, my legs burning from the uphill climb. After 2 hours, I reached the trailhead, where a few hikers were setting up tents and chatting. I told them about the figure, but they shrugged it off, saying it was probably just a hunter or someone living rough in the forest. They said people sometimes lived off the grid in those mountains, but they usually stayed clear of hikers. I called the park ranger's office from a nearby gas station and reported what I had seen. The ranger told me there had been some reports of a man living illegally in the forest, but no one knew much about him. They advised me not to go back alone. That night, back home in my apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The image of that man's face haunted me. He hadn't been a ghost or a wild animal. He was real, and real people could be dangerous in the woods. I learned something important that weekend. Nature is unpredictable, but sometimes the scariest part isn't the wild animals or the dark. It's the other people out there, hiding and watching, waiting. From then on, I never went camping alone in remote areas without telling someone exactly where I was going. I bought a bear spray and a more reliable knife. I studied how to stay safe in the wilderness, not just from animals but from people who might not want to be found. That trip changed the way I saw the outdoors. It wasn't just about adventure or peace anymore. It was about respect for nature, but also for the unknown risks that come with being truly alone. I never went back to that exact spot in West Virginia. The forest was beautiful, yes, but the memory of that night stayed with me. A reminder that sometimes the danger is not from what you expect, but from what you don't see until it's right in front of you. I remember that camping trip like it was yesterday, even though it happened almost 10 years ago. It was the summer of 2015, and I was 27 years old, feeling restless after a long string of stressful months at work. I had decided to take a solo trip to the Pine Ridge Forest, a large, quiet woodland area about a 3-hour drive from my home in Oregon. I wanted to escape everything, no phone, no internet, just me and the wilderness. The first day was perfect. I drove up early in the morning, my car loaded with supplies, a tent, sleeping bag, a portable stove, plenty of food and water, and the usual camping gear. The forest was dense and green, the kind of place where the sunlight barely touches the ground. I found a small clearing near a creek to set up camp. The air smelled fresh, a mix of pine and wet earth. Birds chirped in the distance, and I could hear the gentle rush of water. After pitching my tent, I explored the nearby area. The trees towered above me, their bark rough against my fingertips. The ground was soft with moss and fallen leaves. I followed the creek upstream, noticing tracks in the mud, deer, maybe a raccoon or something else. It was peaceful and beautiful. I was alone but felt safe. As the day went on, I gathered some dry wood and prepared a small fire pit. The sun began to lower, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I cooked a simple meal of canned beans and rice on my stove and sat by the fire, watching the flames flicker. The temperature dropped quickly once the sun disappeared behind the trees. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, feeling the crisp night air settle in. Around 9 p.m., I decided to get inside my tent. I double-checked that everything was secure: the tent poles, the zipper, the rainfly, and crawled into my sleeping bag. I had a small flashlight and my phone, though I'd already switched it off to save battery and avoid distractions. The sounds of the forest at night were strange and new to me. Rustling leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the crackling of twigs under the weight of small animals. It was calming, but also a little unsettling. Then, around midnight, things started to change. I woke up suddenly to a noise outside the tent. It was faint at first, a scraping sound, like something heavy dragging against the ground. My heart jumped. I told myself it was probably a branch moving in the wind or an animal walking nearby. Still, I lay very still, listening. The noise came again, closer this time, a slow, deliberate dragging or scraping sound. I tried to calm myself down, thinking maybe it was a fallen tree branch or a log shifting. Then the noise stopped. I waited, tense, holding my breath, eyes wide in the dark. After a moment, I heard something else. Footsteps, heavy and slow, moving around the perimeter of my tent. I couldn't see anything through the thin tent fabric, but the sound was unmistakable. The footsteps circled the tent more than once, stopping here and there, as if whoever or whatever was out there was searching or looking for something. My mind raced. Bears were common in the area, but bears usually made noise, growled, or scratched at trees, not slow, careful steps. And the dragging noise before didn't fit any animal I knew. The more I thought about it, the more uneasy I became. I wished I'd brought my knife with me inside the tent. I wished I had better protection. After what felt like hours, the footsteps and the dragging noise faded away, replaced again by the usual night sounds of the forest. I stayed awake until dawn, too afraid to fall back asleep. I could still hear faint noises, but nothing as close or deliberate as before. When the first light crept through the trees, I carefully unzipped my tent flap and looked outside. The ground around my campsite was disturbed. Footprints. Not animal prints. Human footprints. They were large, muddy, and came from the nearby path before circling my tent and heading back into the woods. And there was something else, the marks from that dragging sound. A long, dark streak in the dirt, as if something heavy had been pulled along the ground, curving right past my tent. I packed up quickly, my hands shaking as I did. I didn't want to stay another night. As I walked back toward my car, I couldn't help but glance behind me into the forest. The silence felt heavy, watching me like it was waiting. I got in my car and locked the doors. I drove off without looking back. The next day, I reported the footprints to the local ranger station. They told me people sometimes trespassed in the forest, but they hadn't had any recent reports of dangerous behavior. Still, they promised to increase patrols in the area. Looking back, I realized that whoever or whatever had been there was watching me. Not just an animal curious or hungry. The dragging noise, the slow footsteps, the circle around my tent all pointed to someone who knew the forest well. Maybe a poacher or someone hiding from the law, someone who wasn't supposed to be there. The fact that they never tried to contact me, never shouted or made direct threats, made it even more terrifying. They were careful and cautious, but definitely close enough to be a real danger. That trip taught me to never underestimate the quiet wilderness. It's easy to romanticize camping alone in the woods, but out there, away from people, the risks are real. Not from ghosts or fairy tale creatures, but from other humans and the unpredictable nature of the forest itself. Now, when I go camping, I always tell someone exactly where I am going and when I will return. I carry pepper spray and a proper knife. I check in regularly, and I never, ever camp alone in places I don't know. That night in Pine Ridge Forest stayed with me. A chilling reminder that sometimes, the scariest thing in the woods isn't a wild animal, but a stranger watching you in silence. I remember the summer of 2012 like it was yesterday, even though it's been over a decade now. I was 24 at the time, young and stupid enough to think that nothing could go wrong on a simple camping trip. I wanted to get away from the city noise, escape the constant buzz of work and deadlines, and just be alone in the woods for a few days. I chose a remote spot in northern Minnesota, deep in the forest, near a small lake that wasn't on most maps. I found the location from an old blog post, a guy who swore it was perfect for quiet camping. That was the only info I had, and I should have known better. I packed my gear carefully. A tent, sleeping bag, enough food for 3 days, water purifier, first aid kit, a couple of knives, a flashlight, and a map with a compass. No phone signal there, so I left my phone mostly off to save battery, thinking I wouldn't need it anyway. I drove up late afternoon, parked the car about 2 miles from the campsite, and carried my stuff through a narrow dirt trail that quickly disappeared under thick pine trees. The sun was already low by the time I set up my tent near the lake's edge. The air smelled fresh, a mix of pine, wet earth, and the faint scent of fish from the water. That first night, everything felt peaceful. The stars were bright, the lake was calm, and the only sounds were the gentle lapping of water and the occasional call of a loon somewhere across the lake. I made a small fire, cooked some canned beans and rice, and settled down inside my tent with my flashlight and a book. The wind rustled through the branches above, but it wasn't cold. I thought maybe this was exactly what I needed, some real quiet and solitude. But then, around midnight, things started to change. I woke up suddenly, not because of any noise, but because I felt like something was wrong. The air was too still. No wind, no animals moving, just silence. I listened closely, and after a while I heard it, faint footsteps. Soft, slow, deliberate, not running but walking, and they weren't coming from the trail I used. They were circling the camp from the other side of the trees. At first, I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal, but deer don't make footsteps like boots on dry leaves. These steps sounded heavy and measured. I stayed very still, breathing shallow, trying not to make any noise. The footsteps stopped after a few minutes, and the silence came back, but it was different now, thicker, like the forest was holding its breath. I tried to calm down and convince myself it was nothing. The next day, I hiked around the lake, hoping to find some signs of whoever, or whatever, had been there. I found nothing unusual except some broken branches and old footprints in the mud near the water. They weren't animal tracks, that much was clear. The prints looked like boots, size unknown, and they were fresh. They didn't match mine or any trail nearby. I felt a cold knot in my stomach, but tried to shrug it off. Maybe another camper had come through recently, I thought. That night, the footsteps returned. This time, they were closer. I could hear snapping twigs and the faint crunch of dry leaves. I didn't move, I just listened. The footsteps stopped right at the edge of the clearing where my tent was pitched. I held my breath and slowly reached for my flashlight. I shone the light outside, scanning the dark woods, but nothing moved. Just the trees, shadows shifting in the light. I wanted to believe it was just my imagination or an animal, but something didn't feel right. The footsteps had a rhythm, like someone pacing. Then I noticed the firewood pile I had stacked near the tent. Some logs had been moved, and a few sticks were broken. Whoever had been there wasn't just passing by, they were inspecting the camp. That night, sleep was impossible. I stayed awake, flashlight in hand, waiting for whatever it was to show itself again. Hours passed, and finally, I drifted off just before dawn. When morning came, I decided I had to leave. I packed quickly and started walking back to my car. As I followed the trail, I felt eyes on me, the feeling of being watched. I kept looking back but saw nothing. Halfway through the hike, I found a strange thing nailed to a tree. It was a small piece of wood with some crude carvings and what looked like a human tooth tied to it with a thin piece of string. I didn't want to believe it was real, but I knew it was meant for me. A warning. I felt my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. I sped up, almost running now, the forest around me closing in like a trap. When I finally reached my car, I was shaking and drenched in sweat. I locked the doors, started the engine, and drove off without looking back. It wasn't until I was safely home that I realized what had happened. Someone had been watching me the entire time, lurking in the woods. They had come close to my camp multiple times, marking territory and trying to scare me off. The tooth on the tree was a threat or a message, something meant to warn me not to come back. I never went camping alone again after that, and I reported the incident to the local ranger station. They told me it wasn't the first time people had reported someone stalking campers in that area. They said it was likely a squatter or someone living off the grid who didn't want visitors. The whole experience taught me how little control we really have in the wilderness. Nature is one thing, but humans lurking with bad intentions is another. I never saw who it was or caught any clear sign besides those footsteps and the tooth. But that was enough. The fear was real and the danger was too. After that trip, I kept my camping to well-known, crowded places, and I always told someone where I was going. Sometimes the scariest things out there aren't wild animals or bad weather. They're people who don't want you to be there. And that thought stayed with me every time I looked at the woods afterward. I remember the night clearly, even though it's been years. It was the summer of 2018 when I decided to go camping alone in the mountains of Montana. I was 27 then, craving some time away from the city's noise and endless traffic. I picked a spot deep in the Bitterroot National Forest, a place known for its dense woods, winding trails, and a river that ran strong and clear. The plan was simple. Spend 3 days alone with nature, no distractions, no phone signal, just me and the wilderness. I drove for hours until I reached a small dirt parking area. From there, I hiked about 4 miles with my backpack loaded with essentials: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, and a basic first aid kit. The air was thick with the smell of pine and wet earth. Birds chirped in the distance, and I felt a calm I hadn't known for months. I chose a flat spot near the riverbank to set up camp. The ground was soft with fallen leaves and moss, perfect for pitching the tent. By late afternoon, I had my shelter ready, a small fire pit cleared, and water boiling for dinner. I had canned beans and a small pack of trail mix. The sky was turning orange as the sun started to dip behind the tall trees. I ate slowly, enjoying the quiet. After cleaning up, I stacked some firewood and settled by the fire, the flames crackling and sending tiny sparks into the darkening sky. That's when things started feeling off. At first, it was subtle. I thought I heard footsteps behind the tent. Maybe an animal, I told myself. There were definitely bears and mountain lions in the area, but I'd taken precautions. Stored food away from my tent, kept a bear spray handy. The footsteps came again, slow and deliberate. I stayed still, listening. The woods were alive with the normal sounds: rustling leaves, distant bird calls. But these footsteps were different. They weren't random or light. They were heavy, purposeful. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it around. Nothing but trees. The beam caught a few branches swaying, a squirrel maybe, but no sign of anything larger. I settled back down, telling myself it was just my nerves. As night deepened, the temperature dropped fast. I zipped up my sleeping bag and lay close to the fire, which I kept burning low. Then I heard it again, the footsteps, but this time they were closer, too close. They circled my tent, crunching the leaves just a few feet away. My heart pounded so hard I was sure it would give me away. I grabbed my knife and slowly unzipped the tent flap, shining the flashlight out into the darkness. The beam caught a pair of eyes, reflecting bright green just beyond the firelight. My breath hitched. It was a large animal, maybe a bear, but it didn't make a sound. It just stared. Then, it turned and vanished into the shadows. I froze for a moment, then quickly zipped the tent back up. I was too scared to sleep, but too tired to stay awake all night. I sat there, listening, heart racing, until I finally dozed off. I woke hours later to the sound of rustling, this time very close, just outside the tent. My flashlight was dead. The batteries must have died while I was asleep. The fire had burned out. I reached for my phone to use the flashlight, but there was no signal, and the battery was low too. My hands trembled as I tried to shake myself awake. The rustling grew louder, a slow but steady movement all around me. Then I heard a low growl, not like a bear or mountain lion, but something deeper, more guttural. It was close, very close, circling the tent, sniffing the air. I tried to stay still, hoping it wouldn't find me. Suddenly, the tent shook. Something heavy pressed against the fabric, pushing, clawing. The growl turned into a roar. I scrambled to grab my knife, but my hands were shaking too much. The tent was ripped in one spot, a jagged tear big enough to see through. In the faint moonlight, I caught a glimpse of a large black bear. It was massive, its eyes gleaming, claws scraping the tent floor. I froze, knowing any sudden movement could trigger an attack. The bear sniffed again, pawed the ground, and then, after what felt like forever, it pulled back. I waited until it moved away before I slowly unzipped the tent, grabbing my backpack and slipping out. The cold air hit my face, sharp and biting. I moved quietly toward the river, keeping the torn tent behind me. My mind raced, no phone signal, no way to call for help, and a wild animal somewhere nearby. I followed the river downstream, hoping to find the trail back to my car. Every sound made me jump. Branches snapping, water flowing, the occasional hoot of an owl. After what felt like hours, I finally saw the faint glow of my car's headlights through the trees. Relief washed over me like a wave. I ran the last few hundred yards, slipping on wet leaves, until I was finally inside my car, doors locked. I started the engine and turned on the heater, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I looked back at the dark forest, the spot where I had camped, now silent and empty. The next day, I called the ranger station. They told me there had been recent bear activity in the area and warned campers to be extra cautious. My tent was ruined, but I was safe. That night, I realized how close I had come to something dangerous. Not some made-up ghost story, but real, wild nature with its own rules. I never camped alone again. The experience taught me respect. Nature isn't a playground. It's home to creatures bigger and stronger than us. And when we step into it, we're the visitors, not the rulers. I still love the outdoors, but now I go prepared, never underestimating the wild. That night in Montana stayed with me. A reminder that sometimes the scariest stories don't need monsters or magic. They just need the quiet, dark woods and a wild animal, hungry and curious, breathing close enough to remind you that survival depends on respect, caution, and sometimes just plain luck. I remember the trip clearly, even though it was years ago now. It was the summer of 2016, and I was 27. I had been planning this camping trip for months. a chance to escape the noise of the city and get lost in the wild. I picked a spot deep in the Allegheny National Forest in Pennsylvania, a place known for its thick woods, rugged trails, and few visitors. I wanted solitude, and that's exactly what I got. I arrived late in the afternoon, carrying my backpack stuffed with the basics: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a small first aid kit, and a flashlight. The sun was starting to dip low, casting long shadows between the towering pine and oak trees. I found a small clearing by a stream and set up my tent. The sound of the flowing water was soothing, a perfect soundtrack for the night. I made a fire ring with some stones and gathered dry wood nearby. The air was cool and fresh, but there was an odd stillness in the woods, like the trees were holding their breath. As I worked on my campfire, I noticed some broken branches and crushed grass around the clearing, as if something big had passed through recently. It didn't worry me much at first, wild animals, probably a deer or a bear, but something about the way the marks were scattered felt strange, like a path made in a hurry. Still, I shrugged it off, telling myself to focus on the fire. I cooked some canned beans and dried meat over the fire, savoring the warmth and simple taste. The sky above was a deep blue, and stars began to peek out. I sat back against a tree, listening to the night sounds: the rustling leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the chirp of crickets. After a while, the wind picked up, whispering through the branches. I zipped up my jacket tighter and crawled into my tent. Around midnight, the calm shattered. I woke suddenly to a loud cracking sound, like a branch snapping right outside the tent. My heart hammered in my chest. The stream's gentle murmur was gone. Instead, I heard heavy footsteps moving slowly, deliberately. I lay frozen, every muscle tense, straining to listen. The footsteps circled the clearing, getting closer, then retreating a little. Then there was silence. I didn't want to peek outside. I kept my flashlight close, just in case. After a while, I heard a strange noise, a low, guttural growl mixed with something else, like breathing, but harsh and ragged. It wasn't an animal sound I recognized. I had read about bears and wolves, but this was different, deeper, more threatening. Fear gripped me. My mind raced. I tried to remind myself that it could be a bear, or maybe a large animal passing through, but something didn't fit. The noise moved away, and the forest settled back into silence. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening for any hint of movement. At first light, I unzipped the tent carefully and looked around. The fire was nearly out, and the ground around the clearing was disturbed again. There were fresh footprints in the soft soil, huge, uneven, and unlike any animal tracks I had seen before. The prints weren't symmetrical. They looked like they belonged to something dragging a foot or walking awkwardly. I gathered my things quickly. I wanted to leave immediately, but my car was still a couple of miles down the trail. I tried to stay calm and told myself to walk fast but carefully. As I moved through the forest, I kept glancing back, nervous that something was following me. That's when I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the trees, just beyond the trail. At first, I thought it was a man, tall and broad, but the way it stood was wrong. It was hunched forward, its head hanging low. It didn't move as I stared. My breath caught, but I didn't dare make a sound or run. After what felt like an eternity, the figure turned slowly and disappeared into the woods. I didn't stop moving until I reached my car. My hands trembled as I unlocked the doors and threw my gear inside. I started the engine and didn't look back. The forest behind me felt alive with unseen eyes, watching and waiting. On the drive back, my mind was a mess of fear and confusion. Days later, I checked online to see if there were any reports of strange animals or people in the area. I found some forum posts from hikers describing similar experiences. Strange noises at night, large footprints, and glimpses of shadowy figures. No one had a clear explanation, Some guessed it was bears behaving oddly or people playing tricks. Others thought it might be a wild animal unknown to science, but no one knew for sure. I never went camping alone after that trip. The experience left me shaken. The forest that had seemed so peaceful and beautiful turned out to be unpredictable and dangerous in ways I couldn't explain. I kept thinking about that figure, the sound of the growl, and the footprints dragging through the dirt. It was real. Whatever it wasn't something from a ghost story or a legend. It was something alive, and it was out there. Now, when I tell the story, I make it clear. Nature is wild and raw, and sometimes what you think you know isn't enough. The woods don't care about your plans or your safety. You can't always outrun the unknown. I learned that the hard way. The scars aren't on my body, but in my mind. Even years later, the memory feels as sharp as the cold night air, the smell of pine, and the feeling of something watching just beyond the firelight. The forest keeps its secrets, and some are better left alone. I still remember that camping trip like it was yesterday, even though it happened almost 10 years ago. It was the summer of 2015, and I was 24 years old. I had planned a solo trip to the remote areas of the Adirondack Mountains in upstate New York. I wanted a break from the noise of the city, the endless emails, and the crowded subway trains. I thought I could find some peace in the wilderness, maybe get some fresh air and clear my head. I had camped a few times before, but nothing like this. No cell service, no nearby roads, just me and the forest. I arrived at the small ranger station in the morning. The air was cool, crisp, and smelled like pine and wet earth. I packed my gear, a tent, sleeping bag, some canned food, a stove, and my trusty flashlight, and headed to a trail that would take me deep into the forest. The ranger gave me a rough map and warned me to stick to the paths, not to camp near the streams because of bears, and to make sure I had enough food. The first day went well. I hiked about 6 miles, stopping now and then to drink from a bottle or rest on a fallen log. The forest was quiet except for birds and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. I found a good clearing near a small hill where I decided to set up my tent before sunset. The ground was soft with pine needles, and the spot was just right, sheltered by some tall trees but open enough to see the sky. I built a small fire, cooked some canned beans and rice, then lay down on my sleeping pad inside the tent. The sun disappeared, and the woods grew dark fast. I had no cell signal, but that was part of the plan. I wanted to disconnect. I read a bit on my phone, using its battery only for light, then put it away. Around 10 p.m., I heard a strange noise outside. At first, I thought it was a raccoon or some small animal, but it was louder, like footsteps. I froze and listened closely. The sound was coming closer, crunching dry leaves and twigs. My heart started to beat faster. I was alone, miles from anyone, and my mind raced with worst-case scenarios. I remembered the ranger's warning about bears, but the noise didn't sound like an animal. It was too heavy, deliberate. It moved around the clearing but didn't get closer to the tent. I kept quiet, hoping it would go away. After what felt like an hour, the sounds faded into the distance. I waited for a long time before finally forcing myself to sleep, though I barely rested. When morning came, I packed up quickly, eager to leave the spot behind. I started hiking back on the trail, feeling uneasy. About an hour in, I noticed something odd. The trail was littered with broken branches and footprints. Large, deep ones, not like a deer's or any animal I knew. They looked like human footprints, but bigger and heavier. The strange part was that they didn't follow a clear direction. They twisted and turned off the main path into the thick woods. I kept walking but stayed alert. Every so often, I heard noises like snapping branches or low grunts from the bushes around me. It was clear I wasn't alone. The feeling of being watched settled deep in my stomach. The The sky was overcast, and the forest shadows grew longer. I reached a fork in the trail where I had to choose between two paths. The map was unclear, and I debated which way to go. Just then, I spotted something on the ground. A small piece of torn fabric, dirty and soaked in what looked like mud, maybe even dried blood. I shivered and decided to take the left path, hoping it would lead me out faster. The trail became harder to follow. Fallen trees blocked the way, and the forest grew thicker. My legs ached, and my backpack felt heavier than before. I was thirsty, but I didn't want to stop long. Suddenly, I heard the footsteps again, louder this time, but they weren't random. They were behind me, matching my pace. I glanced back but saw nothing through the trees. The feeling of fear became overwhelming. I ran. I don't know how far I went, stumbling over roots and rocks. The sounds behind me quickened, like someone chasing. My lungs burned, my vision blurred with sweat. Eventually, I tripped and fell hard on the ground, scraping my palms and knees. The footsteps stopped right behind me. I lay still, not daring to move. After a long moment, the noises faded. I looked around, heart pounding like a drum. The forest was silent again. I struggled to my feet and kept moving, this time slower but more careful. Eventually, I reached a small dirt road used by forest rangers and hikers. Relief hit me like a wave. I followed it until I saw a park ranger's cabin with smoke rising from its chimney. I banged on the door, exhausted and scared. The ranger answered, and without needing explanations, he radioed for help. I learned later that what I encountered wasn't an animal or a ghost, but a man, or probably more than one, living illegally in the woods. The torn fabric was from a backpack found nearby, along with some abandoned campsites. It seemed like they were watching the trail, maybe even following hikers. The footprints matched those of a large, muscular man. The police searched the area but never caught anyone. The whole thing remained a mystery. But for me, the terror was real. What haunted me wasn't the dark or the silence, but knowing there was someone out there, hidden in the forest, watching and following, ready to come closer when you least expect it. That trip taught me to never underestimate the wilderness, not just for the animals, but for the people who hide in it. I went looking for peace, but I found fear instead. From that day on, I always made sure to camp in well-populated areas, never alone, and to trust my instincts when the forest gets too quiet or too loud with the wrong kind of sounds. Sometimes, when I think back to that night, I can still hear those footsteps echoing behind me, and I'm reminded how close I came to something I never want to face again. I still remember that camping trip like it was yesterday, though it happened over 10 years ago. It was the summer of 2013, and I was 27 at the time. I decided to head out on my own to a remote spot in the Cascade Mountains in Washington state. I had been hiking and camping since I was a kid, but this trip was meant to be a solo challenge, a way to disconnect and test myself. I picked a place called Devil's Ridge, a quiet, less popular area deep in the forest, known mostly by serious hikers. I left early in the morning, carrying my old but reliable backpack, a tent, sleeping bag, some canned food, and enough water. The trail was steep and narrow, cutting through thick pine trees. The air was crisp, and the sun was just breaking through the leaves when I started. The first few hours passed peacefully. I enjoyed the quiet, except for the occasional bird calls and the rustling of small animals in the underbrush. By late afternoon, I reached a small clearing near a creek. It was perfect for setting up camp. The ground was soft, covered with pine needles, and flat enough for my tent. I unpacked slowly, taking my time to arrange everything. After setting the tent, I gathered some dry wood and started a small fire, careful to keep it contained. The fire crackled and popped, and the smell of burning pine filled the air. As the sun went down, the forest darkened quickly. Shadows stretched across the trees, and the usual daytime sounds were replaced by the distant hoot of an owl and the low murmur of the creek. I sat near the fire, sipping lukewarm water from my bottle and eating some canned beans warmed on the flames. I felt calm and satisfied with my solitude. But then, something changed. I heard it first as a faint crunching sound, like someone stepping carefully on dry leaves or twigs. But it wasn't rhythmic or regular like an animal walking. It was slow, deliberate. I froze and listened harder. The sound came from the direction of the creek, maybe 50 yards away. I looked into the darkness beyond the firelight, but all I could see were the shapes of the trees. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a bear moving quietly, but my gut didn't agree. The crunching grew louder, closer, but still slow and careful. It wasn't running or rushing, just a steady, slow movement. I remembered I had a small flashlight and pulled it out. I clicked it on, shining the beam toward the sound. The light cut through the dark, illuminating tree trunks, branches, and underbrush. But I saw nothing. The noise stopped abruptly. For a moment, everything went quiet again. My heart was pounding. I thought about packing up and hiking back down the trail, but it was almost night, and I didn't want to risk getting lost in the dark. So I sat back down, keeping my flashlight ready and my hands close to my pocket knife. Minutes passed. Then, the noise started again. But this time, it wasn't footsteps. It was something heavier, like branches snapping under weight, but at irregular intervals. The sound came closer to the edge of the clearing, right outside the ring of light from my fire. I couldn't see anything, but whatever was out there was big enough to break branches and move through thick bushes. The hairs on my neck stood up. I knew wild animals lived in the forest, but this felt different. This was not a deer or a bear. It was something moving slowly, stalking maybe, but it wasn't making the usual animal sounds. No growls, no calls, just breaking branches and crunching leaves. I slowly reached into my backpack and pulled out a small, compact emergency flare. I clicked it on and threw it toward the noise. The flare burst in bright red light and smoke, casting an eerie glow on the trees. For a second, I thought I saw movement, something large retreating into the shadows. The noises stopped again. The forest fell silent except for my heavy breathing and the crackling fire. I knew I had to keep calm and stay alert. I kept the flare in hand and my flashlight ready, eyes scanning every dark corner of the forest. I thought about all the stories of people getting attacked or lost out here, but I told myself to stay strong. I wasn't going anywhere yet. After what felt like hours, the forest finally settled. No more noises, no more footsteps. The fire burned low, and I leaned back, trying to relax but staying ready. At dawn, I woke up early, light filtering softly through the trees. I packed my things quickly, still feeling uneasy but relieved to see daylight. As I stepped out of the clearing, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Right at the edge of the clearing, pressed into the soft dirt, were large footprints. They were too big to be a human's, maybe 10 or 11 inches long and wide. The shape was strange, like a heavy, flat foot but with long toes. The prints led from the edge of the clearing deep into the forest, following the path I had heard the noises from. I took a deep breath and followed the prints carefully, my flashlight and knife ready. They led me down a narrow slope toward the creek. I noticed broken branches and crushed bushes along the way, signs of a large animal moving through thick forest. As I followed the trail, I saw no more signs of the creature. The prints stopped near a pile of rocks, where the ground was too hard for clear marks. I didn't see or hear the creature again. When I finally reached the trailhead, I felt a mix of relief and confusion. What had been out there? I've always believed in facing nature as it is, but that night made me realize how little we sometimes know about the wild. There are animals out there, maybe unknown or rare, that move quietly and watch us without us noticing. The next day, back in town, I reported the footprints and my experience to the local ranger station. They told me about occasional reports from hikers of strange large footprints, but no one ever caught or saw what they belonged to. They suggested it could be a very large, rare species of bear or even a big cat, but nothing definite. The experience left me shaken but strangely grateful. It reminded me to respect the forest and its secrets, to stay alert and humble in the face of nature. I never camped alone in Devil's Ridge again, but I never stopped loving the wilderness. That night taught me that fear doesn't always come from what we expect. Sometimes it's the unknown, the silent watcher in the dark, and the knowledge that we share this world with creatures beyond our understanding. I'm still not sure what it was, but whatever it was, it made sure I didn't forget that wilderness is wild and we are just visitors. It was late August of 2017 when I decided to go camping alone in the remote parts of the White Mountains in New Hampshire. I'd been itching to get away from the noise of the city and the constant pressure of work. I was 28 at the time, just tired of everything feeling crowded and hectic. I wanted silence, trees, and the kind of isolation that made you feel like you were the only person left in the world. What I didn't expect was just how raw and intense that silence could get when things start going wrong. I packed my gear carefully: tent, sleeping bag, a small stove, food for a few days, plenty of water, and a basic first aid kit. I also had a map and a compass because I knew the spot I was heading to wasn't well marked. It was a small clearing I found by cross-referencing some old hiking forums and topo maps, about 5 miles off the nearest trailhead. Not a place many people visited. The first day was peaceful. I hiked for hours through dense forest, the kind where the sunlight barely touches the ground because of the thick canopy above. I was alert but not nervous, enjoying the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional bird call. When I reached the clearing just before sunset, I set up camp quickly. The area was surrounded by tall pines, their trunks dark and rough, standing like silent guards around my little patch of earth. The ground was soft with pine needles and moss, and a small creek ran nearby, its gentle gurgle the only sound besides the wind in the trees. I made a simple meal, then lit a small fire. The crackle of the flames felt comforting. I sat back, leaning against a rock, watching the fire dance as twilight turned into night. The stars came out, sharp and clear against the black sky. I'd never seen the stars so bright. That's when I first noticed something wasn't quite right. At first, it was just a faint smell, something sharp, metallic, and slightly sweet, like blood mixed with rust. I sniffed the air, looking around. The forest was still. No animals, no wind, just the smell, barely there but unmistakable. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was probably just the creek or some plant. But then I heard it. Soft, low sounds in the distance. Not animal noises, not the usual rustling of leaves. More like muffled footsteps or something heavy moving slowly. I sat up straighter and looked toward the edge of the clearing. The trees stood still. I told myself it was probably a deer or a bear moving through the brush. But I'd been in the woods before and knew what animal sounds sounded like. This was different, too deliberate, too quiet. I decided to ignore it, focusing on keeping the fire alive. I wanted to feel safe. The fire was small but bright, and I kept a knife close on my belt just in case. Around midnight, the noises got closer. I didn't dare look directly, but I could hear branches breaking softly and the occasional snap of twigs. Something was definitely moving around the edge of the clearing, just beyond the firelight. My heart was pounding, but I kept telling myself to stay calm. Maybe it was another camper or a hunter. The area wasn't completely off limits, after all. Then the smell came back, stronger this time. It made my stomach turn. It wasn't natural. It was the smell of fresh blood. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the trees. The beam caught something low and dark. I couldn't make out what it was, but it moved just out of reach, slipping between the trunks. I was frozen. Part of me wanted to run, but I was alone and deep in the forest. Running blind could make things worse. I knew I had to wait and see what was happening. Suddenly, my flashlight flickered and died. I fumbled to turn it back on, heart hammering in my chest. In the darkness, I heard breathing. Not human breathing, but heavy, labored, almost desperate. It was coming from all around me. I grabbed my knife, trying to steady my shaking hands. Then, a loud crack, a branch snapping, came from the other side of the clearing. The firelight wavered as the wind picked up. I made a decision. Couldn't stay there. Whatever was out there wasn't just an animal. It was something else, maybe a person, maybe something injured or worse. I grabbed my pack, leaving the fire and food behind. Moving as quietly as I could, I started toward the creek, hoping to follow it downstream to find a trail or road. The forest was pitch black now, and the sound of the creek was my only guide. But the noises followed me. The footsteps, the breathing, always just out of sight. My skin was crawling, every nerve alert. I kept my knife ready and my ears straining for any other sounds. After what felt like an hour but was probably only 20 minutes, I spotted a faint glow ahead. Relief flooded me, a lantern on a campsite. I stepped closer, and the owners of the camp suddenly appeared. Two hikers who looked as surprised as I was. They helped me get warm and called the park rangers on their satellite phone. I told them everything: the smell, the noises, the breath, the footsteps. The rangers organized a search party the next morning. They found no evidence of any animal or person near my original campsite. No footprints, no dropped items, nothing. Just the fire pit, cold and abandoned. But the strangest part was the creek. When they followed it downstream, about a mile away, they found a spot where some branches had been broken recently and the ground was disturbed. And then there was blood, a small amount, dark and dried. Not enough for a big animal, but enough to show something had been hurt. No one ever explained what it was or who it belonged to. The rangers said it might have been an injured animal or a lost hunter who moved on. For me, though, the experience changed how I think about the woods. The silence isn't just quiet. It can be full of things you don't see or hear clearly, things that don't want to be found. I never went back to that clearing. I don't camp alone anymore. Sometimes, when I'm in the city, I still catch that sharp, metallic smell in the air out of nowhere. It makes me shiver, reminding me that some parts of nature don't want to be disturbed, and some things out there don't want to be found. It was late September of 2019 when I decided to go camping alone in northern Idaho. I was 28 back then, working a boring warehouse job and barely talking to anyone. I needed a break from everything, just a few quiet days somewhere far from city noise, where I could breathe clean air and sleep under the open sky. I picked a spot near Priest Lake after seeing photos online. The place looked peaceful, surrounded by thick pine forests and cold streams running through them. I packed light, just a small tent, sleeping bag, food, water, flashlight, knife, lighter, and a small axe. I left my phone in the car trunk when I got there. I didn't want it buzzing or distracting me. It took me almost 2 hours of hiking to reach a small clearing beside the lake. It wasn't an official campsite. There were no picnic tables, no fire rings, just raw ground, trees, and the quiet movement of water. The air smelled like pine and damp soil. I pitched my tent right beside a cluster of tall trees and started collecting dry wood for a small fire. Everything felt calm and simple at first. I made a small meal, sat by the fire, and just listened to the woods. The sounds were constant: rustling branches, frogs croaking, faint wind pushing through trees. I felt completely alone, but in a good way. The first night passed quietly. I woke up once around 3 a.m. to take a piss and noticed how black the forest was when the fire had burned down. The silence was deep and almost heavy, but it didn't bother me. I went back into my tent, zipped it up, and slept again until sunrise. The next day, I hiked around the lake for hours, exploring small trails that weren't marked. I saw tracks on the ground, some deer prints, and what looked like bear tracks a few times. They didn't look fresh, so I didn't think much of it. I carried a small can of bear spray in my pocket anyway. When I got back to my camp around late afternoon, I noticed something strange. My backpack, which I had left beside the tent, was lying flat on the ground a few feet away from where I left it. The zipper was half open. I thought maybe I forgot to close it properly and it rolled down the slope a little. But the ground wasn't steep and it didn't really make sense. Still, I didn't want to overthink it. That night, after I finished eating and cleaning up, I threw the leftover food scraps into the lake so no animals would come sniffing around. Then I sat quietly by the fire for a while. The air turned colder, and the sound of crickets filled the woods. When I finally went to bed, I felt uneasy for the first time. It wasn't fear exactly, just that strange tension when you feel like the woods around you are awake. I kept hearing faint cracks in the trees, like something stepping slowly over twigs. At one point, I held my breath and listened carefully. It stopped whenever I paid attention. It happened again after a few minutes, soft steps somewhere beyond the trees. I tried to convince myself it was just deer. I zipped the tent tighter and kept my flashlight next to my pillow. I must have drifted off at some point because I woke up suddenly around 2 a.m. to a noise that froze me completely. It was the sound of slow footsteps circling the tent. The steps were light but steady, like someone trying not to make noise. The dry leaves outside crunched faintly. My heart started hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. I lay perfectly still, listening. I didn't move, didn't breathe too loud. Whoever or whatever, it was stopped right behind the tent near my head. I could hear faint breathing, human breathing. I stayed like that for a long time, barely daring to move. Then I heard it again, the sound of something being dragged softly on the ground. I didn't want to turn on the flashlight because the thin tent walls would make it obvious where I was lying. The steps continued around the tent, slow, careful, like someone studying it. Then silence. Nothing but my own heartbeat and the faint sound of the lake. I waited. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself it must have been some animal, maybe a raccoon sniffing around. But deep down, I didn't believe that. When the first light came, I got out of the tent immediately. The ground outside was covered with fresh shoe prints. Not boots, not hiking shoes, bare feet. The prints were long, narrow, and pressed deep into the soil. There were at least a dozen of them, circling my tent, some going toward the lake, others into the trees. My stomach dropped. The prints were adult-sized, not small. I checked my things, nothing was stolen, but my axe had been moved closer to the tent entrance, blade pointing upward. I didn't do that. I packed everything as fast as I could. I didn't even bother making breakfast. I stuffed my sleeping bag, threw the tent into my pack half folded, and started hiking back toward the trailhead. The woods looked different that morning, colder, darker, even though the sun was rising. Every sound made me turn my head. I kept checking behind me every few minutes. I didn't see anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. About an hour into the hike, I stopped to drink water. That's when I saw it, on a tree trunk just a few yards from the trail. Someone had carved a line of deep slashes into the bark, all uneven, as if done with a knife or sharp stone. Beneath the cuts, there was a small bundle tied to the trunk with string. It looked like a piece of animal fur with bones tangled inside. I didn't go near it. I just kept walking faster, trying not to think about what kind of person would make something like that. When I finally reached my car, I felt weak from how tense I'd been. My hands were shaking as I put the gear into the trunk. Before I left, I noticed one more thing. The thin layer of dust on the rear window had a mark drawn into it, a long vertical line with two shorter horizontal ones crossing it, like someone had used their finger to make a simple symbol. I didn't stop to study it. I just started the car and drove until the road curved out of the forest. For weeks after that, I kept replaying everything in my head, trying to find a normal explanation. Maybe some local wandering around at night, maybe a drifter camping nearby who got curious. But the bare footprints, the breathing, the axe move to the tent flap, it didn't feel random. It felt like someone watching me for a while, waiting until the middle of the night to come close. I never went camping alone again after that. I still love the outdoors, but that night changed something in me. I can't hear branches crack in the dark without picturing those quiet, deliberate footsteps circling my tent, or that slow breathing just inches away from my head. Every time I think about it, I remember how helpless I felt lying there, listening, not knowing who was outside or why they were there. It was late September of 2019 when I decided to take a solo camping trip in the northern part of Montana. I had a week off work, and I wanted to get away from the noise, the people, the routine. I'd done a few camping trips before, but this was the first time I planned to go completely alone, far into the forest where I wouldn't run into anyone. I found a small lake on the map, unnamed, a few miles off an old logging road near Glacier National Park. The area wasn't part of any established campground, just a piece of wild land that looked perfect for isolation. I parked my truck at the end of a dirt road, shouldered my heavy pack, and started hiking in the early afternoon. The forest was thick with pine and spruce, and the smell of the trees mixed with cold air was calming. The sky was pale blue, the sun soft. I followed a faded animal trail uphill, crossed a small stream, and kept walking for a few hours. When I finally reached the lake, the water was still and dark, surrounded by trees so dense that light barely touched the ground. It was silent except for the occasional creak of the trees. I set up my small green tent near the shore, built a fire pit from loose rocks, and gathered some branches for firewood. By evening, the temperature had dropped fast. The wind barely moved, and the silence became heavier. I cooked a can of beans over the small fire and watched the orange flames flicker against the still water. The stars came out one by one, and soon the whole sky was covered with them. I felt small sitting there, like I was the only person in the world. It was peaceful, but something about that kind of silence also made me uneasy. It wasn't fear exactly. It was just a sense that anything could be out there watching and I'd never know. When I crawled into my tent that night, I zipped it shut and lay down on my sleeping bag. The cold pressed in quickly, and I could hear the faint sounds of the forest, branches cracking from the wind, maybe a few small animals moving around. I drifted off after a while, but sometime deep in the night, I woke up. It was one of those moments where you're not sure what woke you, but something feels wrong. The air felt heavier, colder. I lay still, breathing quietly, listening. That's when I heard it. A single, slow crunch of leaves. Then another. It was faint, but close enough that I could tell it wasn't something small like a rabbit. It was heavier. I held my breath and kept listening. The sound came again, slow and steady, like footsteps, but dragging a little. It was coming from the tree line behind my tent. My first thought was that it might be a deer, but deer don't move like that. And then there was the rhythm, too deliberate, too slow. I stayed frozen for a long time, maybe 10 minutes, waiting for the sound to stop. It didn't move away, just paused and started again, circling slowly. I wanted to unzip the tent and look out, but the thought of shining my flashlight out there and actually seeing someone, or something, stopped me cold. Eventually, the sound faded off into the woods. I barely slept after that, just lay there staring into the dark fabric above me. counting every small sound until the sky turned gray again. The next morning, the woods were quiet again, like nothing had happened. I stepped outside, stretched, and tried to convince myself it had been an animal. But when I walked around the back of the tent, I saw clear boot prints in the dirt. Not huge, just average-sized, but deep enough that they belonged to a person, not an animal. They circled halfway around the tent and disappeared toward the trees. I looked in that direction for a while, half expecting someone to be standing there. Nothing. The forest was calm, and I couldn't hear a thing except the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. I tried to shake it off and spent most of the morning fishing by the lake. Still, I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder. Every time a branch snapped in the distance, my body tensed up. Around noon, I decided to take a short hike to the ridge behind the lake to get a better view. I left most of my gear behind, just carrying a small pack, knife, and water bottle. The climb took about an hour. When I reached the top, I could see the whole valley, the thick forest, the winding stream, the still lake below. There wasn't a single sign of anyone. But when I headed back down, I noticed something that made my stomach turn. On the narrow trail that led back to camp, there were new footprints, fresh ones, clear in the soft dirt, and they were mine. But on top of them, overlapping, were others. Someone had walked the same trail after me. The prints went in the same direction I had gone, but I couldn't see where they turned off. I went faster after that, almost jogging. My mind was racing the whole way back. When I reached the camp, nothing seemed out of place at first. The tent was still there, my pack still zipped, the fire pit untouched. But when I looked closer, I saw that one of the pockets on my backpack was open. Inside, the small camping knife I'd kept there was gone. I looked around the ground, half expecting it to have fallen out, but it wasn't anywhere near the tent. I packed up everything as quickly as I could. My hands were shaking while I took down the tent. I kept glancing toward the trees, expecting movement. The forest was too quiet. I didn't even bother putting the fire pit rocks back. I just stuffed everything into my pack and started walking back the way I came. The trail felt longer this time. Every step made me more paranoid. Every sound, every crack of a branch or flutter of a bird made my chest tighten. After maybe an hour, I noticed movement behind me. Not close, but far back down the trail. I looked over my shoulder and saw a figure standing between the trees. It wasn't clear through the shadows, but it was definitely a person. They weren't moving, just standing there watching me. I froze. My body went cold, and for a moment I couldn't move. Then I forced myself to keep walking, faster, without looking back again. The rest of the hike was a blur. I don't even remember the last part clearly. When I finally saw the clearing where my truck was parked, I broke into a run. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely fit the keys into the lock. Once I got inside, I slammed the doors shut and locked them. I sat there breathing hard, staring at the tree-line. For a long time, nothing happened. Then I saw him again, just for a second. A person stepping out from behind a tree, standing still, far enough that I couldn't make out their face. I started the engine and drove out as fast as I could. I never found out who it was or what they wanted. I told myself it could have been a hunter or some local wandering the woods, but it didn't make sense why they'd circle my tent, take my knife, or follow me like that. For weeks after, I couldn't sleep properly. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see that figure standing in the trees. I haven't gone camping alone since that trip, and I never will again. It was the summer of 2017, just before college started, when I decided to take a solo camping trip deep into the forests of northern Minnesota. I was 22 years old, a bit tired of city noise, and eager to find some quiet. I had camped before with friends, but this time I wanted to test myself alone. No distractions, no company, just me and the wilderness. The spot I picked was a remote part of the Superior National Forest, far from roads and marked trails, where cell phones hardly worked and the nearest human could be miles away. I arrived mid-afternoon after a long hike, carrying my backpack loaded with essentials, tent, sleeping bag, food, water filter, and a small first aid kit. The ground was soft with pine needles and moss, the trees tall and thick with leaves that filtered the late summer sun. I chose a flat clearing surrounded by firs and maples, perfect for setting up camp. The smell of damp earth and pine sap was strong, the kind of fresh scent that makes you breathe deeper. After pitching my tent and organizing my gear, I spent the next hour exploring the nearby woods, careful to leave markers so I wouldn't get lost. I found a small stream with clear, cold water and filled my bottle. The forest was alive with the sounds of insects, birds, and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. The air was cool and fresh, the sky a deepening blue with the sun sinking low behind the trees. As twilight approached, I returned to camp and built a small fire. The crackling flames gave off warmth and light, and I roasted some simple food over it. Canned beans and a piece of bread I had packed. I kept my knife close and had my backpack ready in case I needed to move fast. The forest grew darker around me as night settled in. Stars appeared in the clear sky above, bright and sharp. The sounds shifted, becoming quieter but more intense. The call of an owl, the distant snap of a twig, the soft howl of wind through the trees. I reminded myself that these noises were normal, part of the wild. But then, something changed. A low, steady noise started far away, almost like a faint engine or a heavy machine. I listened closely, but it didn't sound right. It was too slow, too steady, like a large object moving deliberately through the forest. I felt a small chill despite the fire's warmth. I thought maybe it was a ranger or some logging equipment, but the forest was protected, and I hadn't seen any signs of activity. Still, I kept calm and stayed near the fire. After about 10 minutes, the noise stopped. Silence returned, thick and heavy. I decided to lay down inside the tent, but left the zipper open a crack to keep an eye outside. The air inside the tent was cooler now. Suddenly, I heard the snap of a branch close by, very close. I froze, heart pounding. Something was moving just outside the clearing. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the dark woods. The beam passed over nothing but trees and shadows. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a quick movement. I swung the light toward it again but saw nothing. Minutes felt like hours. I tried to steady my breathing, telling myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon. But then the noise returned. Heavy footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming closer through the underbrush. I could hear the crunch of leaves and broken twigs, right outside the edge of the clearing. Panic rose in my chest. I reached for my pocket knife, gripping it tightly, ready to defend myself. The footsteps stopped. Dead silence again. Then, from behind a tree, a dark figure emerged. It wasn't an animal. It was a man, tall, wearing dark clothes with a backpack similar to mine. His face was hidden by shadows and a hood. I stayed still, barely breathing, watching him move slowly toward my fire. The light caught the glint of a metal object in his hand. A knife. He didn't say anything. He just looked at the fire, then back at me inside the tent. Adrenaline surged through me. I grabbed my flashlight, switched it on, and shone it straight in his face. His eyes widened, but he didn't run. Instead, he took a step back into the trees and disappeared into the darkness. I didn't wait to see if he would come back. I grabbed my pack, extinguished the fire as best as I could, and started running toward the direction I had come from, stumbling over roots and rocks in the dark. I didn't stop to look back. The noise of my own footsteps and heavy breathing filled my ears. After what felt like half an hour, I found the trail and kept running along it until I reached a small ranger station illuminated by a porch light. I was exhausted, shaking, and soaked with sweat. I told the ranger briefly what happened. He nodded seriously and told me to avoid that area. It turned out the man I saw was a known criminal who had been hiding out in the woods, avoiding police. He was dangerous and had already hurt people in other states. I stayed with the ranger until morning. Then he drove me back to the nearest town. I never went back to that forest. The memory of that night stayed with me. The silence before the footsteps, the sudden appearance of the man, the fear that had frozen me in place. It was a harsh lesson that the wild is not just about nature, but sometimes about people you don't want to meet. Camping alone had seemed like a good idea to find peace. Instead, I found something far worse, the feeling of being truly alone and watched with no one around to help. I still go camping sometimes, but never alone, and never without telling someone exactly where I'm going. That night taught me to respect the wilderness and the dangers hidden in its shadows, not just from animals or the weather, but from other people too. Sometimes the scariest thing in the woods isn't the unknown. It's the all too real danger of another person you never expected to meet. It was the summer of 2012 when I decided to go camping alone in the remote woods of northern Minnesota. I was 28 then, craving a break from the noise and rush of city life. I had planned this trip for weeks, packing my backpack with everything I thought I would need: a tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a small stove, flashlight, and a pocket knife. The weather forecast was clear, and the area I chose was known for its beauty and quiet isolation. I wanted to be completely alone, to experience nature in a raw way, without distractions. After a long drive, I parked my car at a small dirt trailhead and started walking deep into the forest. The sun was high, filtering through tall pines and birches, casting long shadows on the forest floor. The air smelled of pine needles, fresh earth, and a faint hint of something musky. Birds chirped occasionally, but everything felt peaceful and still. I walked for about 2 hours, following a narrow path that led to a small clearing beside a slow-moving stream. The spot was perfect. I could hear the gentle babble of water over rocks, and there was enough open space for my tent. I set up camp carefully, making sure everything was secure. The ground was soft but dry, and the air was warm but cooling down slowly as the day ended. As the sun dipped lower, I started a small fire using dry twigs and branches I found nearby. The flames crackled and glowed orange, throwing dancing shadows on the trees. I cooked some canned beans on my stove and ate slowly, savoring the quiet. Around me, the forest began to change. The birds stopped singing, and a heavy silence took over. The only sound was the occasional crack of a branch somewhere in the distance. I cleaned up my spot and crawled into my tent before the sky was fully dark. I wanted to get a good night's sleep because I planned to hike more the next day. The inside of the tent felt safe and warm, a small cocoon against the vast wilderness. But then, sometime past midnight, I woke up. At first, I couldn't tell why. The forest was alive with strange sounds. Something different, something close. My heart started beating faster when I heard a low, slow crunching noise near the edge of the clearing. It wasn't like a normal animal moving. It sounded heavy, deliberate. I stayed still, holding my breath, straining to listen. The crunching got closer, stopping just outside the tent. My flashlight was on the ground beside me, so I reached for it quietly and switched it on. The beam cut through the dark, showing nothing but trees and the shadowy shapes of bushes. But then I noticed something strange. Footprints. Large, heavy, muddy footprints pressed into the soft earth right outside my tent's entrance. They were unlike any I had seen before, bigger and wider than a man's. but without clear claw marks or toes that matched any animal I knew. Panic rose inside me, but I kept my breathing steady. I remembered I had packed my pocket knife, and I gripped it tightly. The sound of breathing came then, low and rough, just outside the tent's thin wall. It wasn't animal breathing, at least not like a deer or bear's. It was slow and deep, like someone was trying to be quiet but was out of breath. Minutes passed. I didn't dare move or make noise. The heavy footsteps retreated slowly, crunching back through the leaves and twigs, fading into the night. I couldn't sleep after that. I stayed awake the whole night, flashlight in hand, watching every shadow. My mind raced with questions. Who or what was out there? Was it someone lost or dangerous? Was it an animal I didn't know? I tried to calm myself by thinking logically. Maybe a hunter or another camper. But the prints didn't match boots, and I hadn't heard voices. At first light, I packed up quickly, my hands shaking. I didn't want to stay any longer. I followed the path back to my car, glancing around nervously every few steps. The forest felt different in the daylight, less menacing but still eerie. The prints were gone, as if whoever or whatever made them had vanished. When I reached my car, I locked the doors and sat inside, breathing heavily. I called a friend to come pick me up as soon as possible. The idea of being alone in the woods after that night was too much. While waiting, I reviewed what had happened in my mind, trying to understand it all. Later, I learned from a local ranger that there had been reports of a wild black bear in that area, injured and acting strangely. They said it had been sighted nearby, moving oddly and making deep growling sounds. The footprints I saw could have been from that bear, swollen paws pressing into the soft earth, and the breathing might have been the bear's heavy panting from pain or exhaustion. The thought made sense, and it explained the heavy footsteps and breathing without needing to imagine something supernatural. Bears can be dangerous, especially when injured or cornered. I realized how lucky I was to have stayed calm and quiet that night. After that experience, I never went camping alone again. I learned that nature is beautiful but unpredictable, and that sometimes the scariest moments come from the real world, not stories or myths. The next time I visited those woods, I made sure to bring a friend, and we stayed on well-traveled paths. The memory of that night stayed with me, a clear reminder to respect the wilderness and the creatures that live there. Even in a place that seems quiet and safe, there can be unexpected dangers lurking, and the best thing you can do is be prepared and aware. That night changed how I see camping forever. It wasn't just a fun escape anymore. It was a lesson in caution and respect. I didn't just survive that night, I learned from it, and in the end, that made all the difference. It was the summer of 2017 when I decided to go camping alone in the remote forests of northern Idaho. I was 28, had a few years of hiking experience, and thought I was prepared. The area I picked was about 50 miles from the nearest town, deep in the wilderness with dense pine trees and rugged terrain. The plan was simple: spend 3 days out there, disconnect from everything, and enjoy the quiet. I packed light but smart. A sturdy tent, sleeping bag, enough food and water, a first aid kit, a compass, a flashlight, and a hunting knife. I was confident. I'd scouted the area on maps and checked weather reports. No rain was expected. When I arrived late afternoon, the sun was low but still warm. I parked my old Jeep at the trailhead, double-checked my gear, then started the hike in with my backpack. The path was narrow and overgrown in some places, with the sounds of birds and insects all around. After an hour, I found a good clearing about the size of a small backyard. It was surrounded by tall pines with thick underbrush. The ground was soft with pine needles, and I spotted a small stream a short walk away. I set up my tent there, close enough to hear the water but not too close to risk flooding if it rained. After pitching the tent, I gathered some dry wood and started a small campfire. I sat back on a log, eating a simple meal of canned beans and crackers. The forest was alive with sounds. The rustling of leaves, the distant calls of birds settling down for the night. As dusk turned to dark, I was careful to keep my fire low and my flashlight ready. I had my phone on airplane mode, but with no signal, it was useless for calls. I wasn't worried. Alone in the wild like this was something I enjoyed. It made me feel alive. But that night, things started to feel different. Around 10 p.m., I heard a sound outside the campfire's glow. Something was moving in the trees. At first, I thought it was a deer or a raccoon. I stayed still, listening hard. The noise was soft but steady. Twigs snapping, leaves crunching, slow steps. It didn't sound like the usual forest animals. I flicked on my flashlight and scanned the tree line, but saw nothing. My heart rate picked up slightly. I reminded myself that this was normal. Wild animals moved at night, and I was just new to hearing it up close. I decided to zip up the tent and go to sleep. The tent walls muffled the sounds, but I could still hear the forest breathing outside. Then, a different noise came. Something heavier, dragging slowly, stopping, then moving again. It wasn't a deer or raccoon. I lay still, eyes wide open, flashlight by my side. At about 1 a.m., my tent shook slightly. It wasn't strong, but enough to make me freeze. I listened hard. The dragging sound was closer now. My mind raced. Could it be a bear? The area was known for black bears. I had bear spray, but it was in my backpack outside the tent. Panic started to creep in. Suddenly, the firelight outside flickered. I realized the fire had almost died down completely. That was the only light source outside the tent. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent quietly. The night air was cold and damp. I scanned the clearing with my light. The fire pit was empty, no fire at all. I couldn't see any movement, but the dragging sound returned, just beyond the treeline. I made the decision to get out of there. Packing up the tent in the dark was difficult. My hands trembled. I grabbed my backpack and slung it on. As I stood up, a heavy branch snapped close by. I froze. The dragging sound stopped immediately. I felt eyes on me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I didn't wait for anything else. I started running down the trail as fast as I could, using my flashlight to see the path. The uneven ground made me stumble a couple of times, but I pushed forward. The forest was thick, and the sounds of movement seemed to chase me. Twigs breaking, heavy breathing, maybe. I was out of breath and scared, but I kept running until I reached my Jeep. The headlights spilled bright light into the dark forest. I locked the doors and sat there, heart pounding. I thought about calling for help, but there was no signal. I just sat there, waiting for first light. At dawn, I got out and looked around carefully. The campsite was empty except for some scattered pine needles and a few footprints I didn't recognize. Large, heavy prints, deeper than any deer tracks. I gathered my gear fast and decided not to stay another night. Driving back, I felt a mix of relief and unease. What had followed me? I never saw it clearly, but I knew it was no ordinary animal. Bears don't drag things slowly through the woods, and the prints were too big for any normal wild animal in that area. I reported what I saw to the local ranger station when I got signal again, but they said nothing recent was reported. Maybe I had been lucky to get out when I did. I never went back to that spot. That camping trip taught me something important. No matter how prepared you think you are, the wild is unpredictable. You can plan for weather and animals, but sometimes the real danger is just being alone in a place where something bigger and unknown is watching you. The memory still lingers. Those heavy footsteps in the night, the silence after the dragging stopped, the way my campfire just went out without wind or rain. I never found out what exactly was there, but I don't plan to try again. Sometimes the safest choice is to respect the wild and walk away when things don't feel right. It was the summer of 2017 when I decided to go camping alone for the first time. I had always gone with friends before, but that year, everyone had different plans. I wanted to challenge myself a bit, get away from people, and just be in the woods for a few days. I chose a spot deep inside the Olympic National Forest in Washington. I'd read about a narrow trail that led to an old, unmarked clearing near a stream where a few campers went decades ago. The idea of being somewhere that wasn't crowded or known sounded peaceful. I parked my old Jeep Cherokee at a small pull-off where the dirt trail began. The forest around me was thick and quiet, the air cool and heavy with the smell of wet soil and pine. I started hiking around noon, carrying my backpack, tent, food, and a few essentials like a flashlight, knife, and water filter. The trail started out clear, but after a few miles, it turned rougher and harder to follow. Fallen trees blocked parts of it, and there were spots where I had to guess which direction to take because the path seemed to fade into the undergrowth. By the time I reached the clearing, it was close to 5 p.m. The place was perfect, about the size of a small backyard, surrounded by tall fir trees that blocked most of the wind. A shallow stream ran about 50 yards away. The ground was uneven but dry, and there were old signs of human presence. A blackened patch of earth that looked like it had been used for campfires long ago, and a rusted tin can half buried in dirt. I set up my tent near the center of the clearing and started collecting wood for a fire. The forest was silent except for the occasional creak of trees and the faint trickle of the stream. After I got the fire going and ate a small meal, I sat there watching the flames flicker against the darkening woods. The silence around me started to feel heavier as the night settled in. I could hear every tiny movement, a snapping twig, a bird flapping somewhere, leaves rustling in the breeze. Around midnight, I was lying in my tent trying to sleep when I heard something faint, a sharp crack like a branch snapping under weight. I froze. It wasn't a small sound. It wasn't a squirrel or rabbit kind of noise. It was heavier. My first thought was maybe a deer. I lay there completely still, listening. Then I heard another step, slow, deliberate, crunching through the layer of dry needles and leaves outside the tent. It stopped, then another step closer. I felt my chest tighten as I reached for the flashlight. The sound circled halfway around the tent, then stopped again. I waited a few minutes before I finally clicked on the light and pointed it toward the tent wall. The thin fabric glowed pale yellow, but I didn't see a shadow. Everything outside looked still. I stayed awake for at least another hour, listening, my hand gripping the flashlight the whole time. Eventually, the forest went quiet again, and I managed to drift off. When morning came, I stepped out and looked around the campsite. The first thing I noticed was that the pile of firewood I'd gathered was scattered, like something had walked right through it. About 10 feet from the tent, I saw faint impressions in the dirt. Not clear footprints, but depressions where something heavy had pressed down. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, maybe a bear, and I spent most of the morning keeping busy, making coffee, cleaning up, and walking down to the stream. Still, the whole time, I had that uneasy feeling like I was being watched. I decided to stay one more night, though I kept debating if I should just pack up and leave. I told myself I was just overthinking things. By evening, the sky turned gray and the air felt thicker, as if rain was coming. I made a small fire and cooked a simple meal. The woods were quiet again, almost too quiet. The sound of insects faded completely after dark, which felt strange. Around 9 p.m., as I sat beside the fire, I heard something again. Faint movement near the tree-line. I turned the flashlight toward the sound and caught a glimpse of something between the trees. Not an animal, but a shape. For a second, it looked like a person, tall, motionless. My stomach dropped. I shouted out instinctively, but the figure didn't move. Then, after maybe 2 seconds, it turned slightly and slipped behind a tree. I stood up, heart pounding, trying to focus the light where it disappeared. I didn't hear running or footsteps, just silence. I stayed frozen for a minute before grabbing my knife and moving slowly toward the tent. I couldn't see anything else, but that sense of being watched grew stronger, almost physical. The rest of that night was hell. I stayed inside the tent with the flashlight on, barely blinking. Every hour or so, I'd hear something faint, twigs breaking, the soft rustle of leaves, but never close enough to see what it was. I didn't sleep at all. When the sun finally came up, I packed everything as fast as I could. As I took down the tent, I noticed something that made me stop cold. About 30 feet from where I'd been sleeping, near the edge of the clearing, there were fresh shoe prints in the mud. Not boots or hiking shoes, but worn sneakers. The tracks were deep and clear, like someone had stood there for a while facing the campsite. I followed them a few steps, and they led deeper into the trees where they suddenly stopped, like whoever it was had turned and walked back the way they came. That was it for me. I loaded my pack and left, not even stopping for water at the stream. I hiked fast, barely paying attention to where I was stepping. A few times, I thought I heard faint movement behind me, but I didn't look back. When I finally saw my Jeep through the trees, I almost ran the last 100 yards. Before leaving, I glanced one last time toward the trail I'd just come from. The woods looked still and empty again, like nothing had happened. I got in the car, locked the doors, and drove until I hit the main road. For days after that, I couldn't stop thinking about those footprints. They weren't old. They weren't animal tracks. Someone had been watching me out there. Someone had come close to my tent that night. Maybe it was just a drifter, or maybe someone living deep in those woods. But I'll never know. I deleted every camping app from my phone that week and sold most of my gear soon after. I still hike sometimes, but I've never camped alone again. Not after realizing how quiet the forest gets when someone else is standing just out of sight, waiting, watching, saying nothing. The night was colder than I expected for early October in northern Maine. I had been looking forward to this solo camping trip for weeks, a chance to get away from everything and spend some time alone in the wilderness. I was 28, had spent a good part of my life working in offices, and needed this break. I wasn't some outdoors expert, but I had some camping experience. Nothing too crazy, just basic hiking and overnight trips. This time, I picked a spot near Baxter State Park, somewhere off the beaten path, but not too far from the main trails. I wanted quiet. I wanted nothing but the sound of the woods. The first day was uneventful but beautiful. The trees were a mix of pines and maples, and some leaves had already turned fiery red and gold. I carried a heavy pack with a tent, a sleeping bag, some canned food, a small stove, and a flashlight. I found a clearing by a small stream just before sunset and set up camp. The ground was soft with fallen leaves and pine needles. I managed to get a fire going, ate a simple dinner of beans and canned corn, and watched the flames flicker as darkness settled in. The forest grew quiet except for the occasional call of an owl and the rustling of small animals moving through the brush. I felt a kind of peaceful isolation that I hadn't experienced in a long time. I laid back on my sleeping pad inside the tent and stared up at the fabric ceiling, the thin nylon barely hiding the moonlight. But as the night deepened, I started noticing things. At first, it was just small sounds, branches snapping far off in the woods. I told myself it was just deer or raccoons moving about, the kind of sounds you expect in the wild. But then, I heard something heavier, like footsteps, crunching leaves, closer and closer. My heart jumped each time. I tried to calm down, telling myself there was no one else out here. But the feeling of being watched crept in slowly, wrapping around my neck like a cold hand. I checked my flashlight and peered out the tent's mesh window, but all I could see was the black outline of trees and the shining stream beyond. The fire had burned down to embers, and the night air was sharp against my skin. I told myself to ignore it and try to sleep. I wasn't in the mood for stories about crazed campers or bears. The footsteps kept coming, pacing around the perimeter of my small camp. Sometimes it sounded like someone was circling me, stepping lightly but deliberately. I froze, listening carefully, my breath caught in my throat. Then the silence. Long, thick silence that seemed to press on my ears. Suddenly, a heavy thud landed just beyond my tent, somewhere close enough to shake the earth slightly. My heart skipped a beat. I wanted to scream, to grab my knife, to do anything. Instead, I stayed perfectly still, trying to listen. The footsteps faded away slowly. I waited a long time, feeling my pulse pound in my ears, waiting for the sound to return. It never did. Morning light finally seeped through the trees, turning the forest a soft green and gold. I zipped open the tent and stepped out, breathing the cold air deeply. The world looked so normal in daylight. Birds chirping, squirrels darting up trees, the stream babbling softly. But then I saw it. A set of footprints, large and heavy, circled the campfire spot in the dirt. They were not animal prints. These were deep, human-like prints, made by boots or heavy shoes. The tracks went all the way around my tent, then disappeared into the thick brush. I looked around nervously, scanning for anything else unusual. Nothing but the usual trees and fallen leaves. I packed up quickly, my hands trembling a little. I didn't want to stay another night, not after what I'd heard and saw. As I hiked out, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching me from the trees. Back in town, I told a park ranger about the prints. He nodded slowly and said there had been reports of illegal hunters and sometimes squatters in the area. People who didn't want to be found, who sometimes got aggressive if they felt threatened. It wasn't a ghost story or some made-up tale. It was real, and I had been lucky to get out when I did. The entire time I was on that trail, I hadn't thought much about the possibility of running into other people. I just wanted to be alone in nature. But the truth is, the wilderness isn't empty. Sometimes it hides others, people who might not have good intentions, who use the forest to stay hidden from the world. When you're alone and vulnerable, that's when it gets dangerous. That trip changed how I looked at the outdoors forever. I still love the quiet and the trees, but now I always carry extra gear. A way to call for help, pepper spray, a stronger knife. I check in with rangers or friends before heading out. And I don't ignore the sounds anymore. Because in the wilderness, sometimes the scariest things aren't shadows or animals. They're the people you don't see until it's almost too late. The memory of that night still haunts me, not because of anything supernatural, but because I know how close I came to something real and dangerous. I was lucky, and I'm grateful I didn't wait too long to leave. When I finally got back to my car, with the sun high and the road buzzing with cars and people, I felt like I had left a piece of myself behind in that forest. A piece that will always remind me to respect the wild and to be ready for whatever or whoever might be out there waiting. The summer of 2019 felt like the perfect time to get away. I'd been stuck in the city for months, overwhelmed by work and the constant noise. I decided to take a solo camping trip, something simple, somewhere quiet to clear my head. I found a small national forest in northern Michigan, a place far enough from the city to lose all sense of time and distraction. I wasn't a seasoned camper, just someone who liked nature and the idea of being alone with the stars. I packed the essentials: a lightweight tent, a sleeping bag, a basic stove, water, some canned food, and a small first aid kit. My backpack wasn't heavy, but it was full enough to make the hike to my spot tiring. The trail wasn't well marked, which I thought added to the adventure, but also made me a little nervous. It was mid-August. The woods were thick with green leaves. The air still warm, but with a hint of the coming fall. After about 2 hours of hiking, I found a small clearing near a slow-moving creek. The ground was soft with moss and pine needles, perfect for pitching my tent. I set up camp just before sunset, the sky turning soft pink and orange behind the tall trees. The silence was deep, broken only by the occasional bird and the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. I made a small fire pit with stones, gathered some dry wood, and soon had a steady flame flickering. That first night was peaceful. The fire crackled and popped, the stars shone bright, and I felt like I was miles from the chaos of everyday life. I ate my canned beans warmed over the fire and stretched out in my sleeping bag. I fell asleep with the sound of the creek nearby and the cool night air on my skin. Around midnight, I woke up. Something felt off. The woods were usually full of nighttime sounds. Crickets, frogs, the occasional owl. But now everything was strangely quiet. I strained my eyes outside the tent flap. The fire was almost out. The shadows of trees moved slightly in the moonlight, but I saw no animals. Then I heard it. A faint snap of a twig, far enough not to startle me but close enough to make me tense. I told myself it was probably a deer or some small animal. The woods were full of them. I closed my eyes, trying to relax, but then came another noise. This time it was a low thud, like something heavy landing on the ground. It was slow, deliberate. I sat up quickly, heart pounding. My flashlight lay next to me, so I grabbed it and carefully unzipped the tent just enough to shine the beam outside. The beam caught the glint of something moving just beyond the fire's edge. A dark shape, bigger than any deer I knew. It moved slowly between the trees, staying just out of clear sight. My mind raced. I wasn't armed, just a small pocket knife in my pack. The shape stopped briefly, and I thought I saw the outline of a person. But why would anyone be out here at this hour near my camp? I decided to keep quiet, hoping whatever it was would leave. But the noises didn't stop. In fact, they got worse. Branches snapping under heavy feet. The sound of breathing, slow and deep, too loud to be an animal hiding. I didn't want to panic, but the feeling of being watched pressed down on me. I tried to think calmly. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal, no way to call for help. The fire had nearly died, so I carefully blew it back to life, hoping the light and smoke might keep anything away. Then came the footsteps, slow and measured, moving closer to my tent. I held my breath, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. The zipper of my tent started to pull down slowly, the cold metal scraping against the fabric. I didn't scream or move. I just waited. The zipper stopped. The shape paused. I heard a whisper, but it wasn't words, just breath and some quiet movement. Then the zipper zipped back up. The footsteps faded, and silence returned. I sat frozen for what felt like an hour, heart racing, staring at the tent wall. After the silence stretched long enough, I forced myself to move. I gathered every bit of firewood I could find, piled it high, and lit a big fire. I stayed awake, eyes darting around every shadow. Morning finally came with a soft light and birdsong. I unzipped the tent cautiously and scanned the clearing. There were footprints in the damp earth near my camp. Large, heavy prints, not from any animal I recognized. They led from the tree line to the edge of the fire pit and then disappeared back into the forest. I packed my things quickly, my hands shaking. I didn't want to stay one more second. The trail back felt longer, and every rustle in the underbrush made me jump. I kept my knife in my hand, scanning constantly. Back at my car, I locked the doors and sat inside for a long time before driving away. I didn't report the incident. I wasn't sure what I'd say, and part of me worried that if I did, someone might think I imagined it. But the prints on the ground were real, and the feeling of being stalked stayed with me long after. Looking back, I think what scared me most was not knowing who or what had been out there. No fairy tale monsters or ghosts, just a person, or maybe more than one, moving silently in the dark woods. Someone watching, maybe waiting. It reminded me that the wilderness is not just beautiful and peaceful. It's wild, and sometimes dangerous, especially when you're alone and vulnerable. Since that night, I've never camped alone in a place so remote. I've learned to respect the silence of the forest and to trust my instincts when something feels wrong. That summer in Michigan taught me that real fear doesn't come from fantasy. It comes from the unknown, from the real possibility that there are others out there, hidden in the shadows, watching. And sometimes all you can do is leave. The summer of 2017, I decided to take a solo camping trip deep into the forests of northern Maine. I'd been itching for some time alone, away from the noise of city life and the constant buzz of work. I was 27 then, fit, used to hiking, but not exactly an expert. I had a decent backpack, a small tent, enough food for a few days, and a basic first aid kit. I picked a spot I'd read about in some old hiking forum, a clearing near a small lake surrounded by thick pine trees and rocky hills. The plan was simple: hike in, camp, fish if I could, and hike out after 3 days. Nothing fancy. The first day went well enough. I followed a faint trail that twisted through dense woods, with birds chirping and a light breeze rustling the leaves. I stopped to set up camp near the lake's edge just before dusk. The place was quiet, except for the soft lapping of water and the occasional call of a loon. I gathered wood for a fire, set up my tent, and ate a simple dinner of canned beans and crackers. The sun dipped below the treetops, and the temperature dropped quickly. I sat close to the fire, watching the flames dance, feeling the peaceful solitude. Night came fast. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag and tried to get comfortable, but the forest sounds kept me alert. Somewhere nearby, a branch snapped, and I tensed, thinking maybe a deer or some other animal. I reminded myself that was normal here and tried to relax. The fire slowly died down to embers. I had no cell signal, no way to call anyone, but I didn't mind. I liked being out of reach. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a faint noise. It was a soft but repeated tapping sound, like something lightly hitting the tent's outer fabric. My heart sped up. At first, I thought maybe rain, but I checked outside with a flashlight. Clear sky, no rain. The tapping kept coming, irregular but persistent. I stayed still, listening hard. It wasn't random wind noise, that was for sure. Something or someone was out there. I didn't dare unzip the tent fully, but I cracked it open just enough to peek out. The fire was nothing but cold ashes. The trees were dark and still, but the tapping continued. It wasn't close, maybe 20 feet away. I grabbed my small camping knife from the side pocket, feeling the cold metal reassuring in my hand. The tapping stopped suddenly. Complete silence. I waited a long minute, then suddenly, the sound of footsteps on dry leaves, slow and deliberate, moved around the tent's perimeter. They weren't fast or panicked, but steady. I held my breath. The footsteps circled once, maybe twice, then stopped. I didn't see anything through the tent's thin walls, just shadows shifting with the faint moonlight filtering through the trees. My mind raced. Could it be another camper? Maybe someone lost? Or someone less friendly? I'd heard stories about people camping in the woods and running into trouble, people with bad intentions. I wasn't carrying anything valuable, but the idea of a stranger creeping around in the middle of the night was enough to make me shake. I kept my knife close, and eventually, the footsteps faded away. By dawn, I was exhausted but relieved. I packed up quickly, not wanting to stay 1 minute longer. On my way back, I took a slightly different route, hoping to spot any signs of who or what had been there. Not far from my campsite, I found something that made my blood run cold. A small, roughly made campfire pit, not far from where I'd set up. It looked fresh, with broken twigs and scorched stones, but no tent or gear nearby. It seemed like someone had been watching me, maybe even waiting. The worst part was the shallow hole dug nearby. It wasn't deep, but enough to hide something. I didn't stay to check what, too scared to dig around. The whole situation suddenly made sense. The tapping on my tent, the footsteps circling at night. It wasn't an accident. Someone had been there watching me sleep. When I got back to town, I reported the incident to the park rangers. They told me that there had been some reports over the past few months of a man living off-grid in those woods. No one had been able to find him, but there were signs of campsites and movement. They warned me to be careful if I ever camped there again. After that night, I never camped alone in the deep forest again. The experience stuck with me, the feeling of being watched, vulnerable in the dark, and the reality that not all dangers in the wilderness come from nature. Sometimes, the scariest thing is knowing someone else is out there, silent and waiting, with unknown intentions. It changed how I looked at the woods forever. Looking back, I realized how lucky I was. I had enough presence of mind to stay calm, keep my knife handy, and leave quickly. If the man had been less cautious or more aggressive, things could have gone much worse. That night wasn't about ghosts or stories. It was about real danger, the kind you don't see coming until it's too late. This experience taught me that nature, for all its beauty, can hide threats not just from animals or weather, but from people. And sometimes, the safest place is not out in the woods alone, but somewhere where you can be sure you're not alone. The summer of 2018 was supposed to be one of the best times of my life. I had just turned 24, freshly out of college, and itching for some time away from the city's noise and crowds. I'd chosen a remote spot deep in the Appalachian Mountains, somewhere off the beaten path, far from any marked trails. The plan was simple: spend 3 days camping alone, with nothing but my backpack, a tent, a small stove, and my camera to capture the untouched wilderness. I arrived late afternoon on a Friday, the sun dipping low but still warm. The air was crisp, scented with pine and damp earth. The path leading to my camping spot was narrow and overgrown, proof that few people ventured here. My boots crunched on dry leaves as I hiked deeper into the forest, stepping over fallen branches and squeezing past thick bushes. Every step felt like a small victory. This was exactly the kind of solitude I'd wanted. I found the clearing I'd marked on my map just before dusk. It was perfect, flat ground, surrounded by tall pines, with a small creek trickling nearby. I pitched my tent carefully, making sure it was secure and level. The quiet around me was almost absolute, broken only by the sound of water running and the distant calls of birds settling in for the night. As I started gathering some dry wood for a fire, I noticed the sky darkening faster than expected. The forecast hadn't mentioned rain, but thick clouds rolled in quickly, casting an eerie gray shadow over the forest. I shrugged it off and got the fire going anyway. Flames crackled, sending flickers of orange light dancing across the trees. I cooked a simple meal, instant noodles with some canned beans, and ate slowly, savoring the calm around me. The sun finally disappeared completely, and the forest settled into a deep, heavy silence. The only light came from the fire and the stars faintly visible through the thinning canopy. Around 10 p.m., I crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and tried to sleep. But the woods didn't want me to rest. Just as I was drifting off, I heard a sudden snap, a sharp breaking of a branch somewhere close. I froze, heart pounding, straining to hear anything else. After a few tense moments, silence returned. Maybe an animal, I told myself. Deer or maybe a raccoon. But then, a low rustling started on the edge of the clearing. It was slow, deliberate, something moving through the underbrush, stepping carefully but steadily. I switched on my small flashlight and shone it outside the tent, but the beam only caught shadows and shifting leaves. Whatever it was, it stayed just beyond the firelight. Minutes passed, and the rustling came closer. I stayed very still, trying to keep calm. Then I heard another sound, a soft thud against a tree, as if something heavy had been pressed or thrown there. The fire flickered. I reached for my phone to check the time and my signal. There was none, of course. My mind raced through possibilities. Could it be a bear? I'd read plenty of warnings about wildlife, but I had taken precautions. My food was sealed tightly and stored away from the tent. Still, the idea of a bear watching me from the shadows was terrifying. But the noises didn't sound like an animal moving. They were too calculated, almost like someone moving around deliberately. I tried to remind myself I was alone and safe, but my instincts screamed otherwise. I grabbed my small camping knife and unzipped the tent slightly to peer out again. The rustling had stopped, but now I saw footprints. Large human footprints pressed deeply into the soft earth just outside the clearing. They weren't animal tracks. Fear set in. Whoever or whatever had been here was not far away. I quickly zipped the tent closed and sat back against the wall, listening. My breathing was loud in my ears, heart hammering. Suddenly, I heard footsteps walking slowly around the perimeter of the clearing, careful but purposeful. They circled the fire, stopping every now and then, as if searching for something. I held my breath, clutching my knife. The night stretched on, the footsteps never leaving the area. At some point, I heard a low humming, like someone trying to mimic a bird call or some kind of sound to throw off animals or maybe me. The fire began to die down, but I didn't dare move to add wood. I stayed awake, eyes wide, waiting for dawn. When the first light finally crept through the trees, I made myself stay still until the sun was well above the horizon. Then, with trembling hands, I unzipped my tent and stepped outside. The clearing looked normal again, but the footprints were still there, large, clear impressions in the mud circling where I'd camped. I gathered my things quickly, heart still racing. On the way back, I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone watching from the trees. I was shaken but knew I had to get out. Hours later, I reached the ranger station at the edge of the park and told them what happened. The rangers nodded, taking notes. They told me stories of people who'd been camping in that area and found signs of someone else. Hunters or poachers who sometimes lived illegally in the woods, moving quietly and watching. They warned me to be careful and to camp only in official sites from then on. Looking back, I realized how lucky I was. I'd been so focused on the beauty and solitude of nature that I hadn't considered the real dangers that aren't supernatural, but human. The idea that someone could be so close in the dark, watching, circling, and waiting, it was the scariest thing of all. That trip changed how I think about the wilderness. It's not just animals or whether you have to worry about. It's other people too. People who don't belong there, who watch in silence, and who can be more dangerous than anything else out in the wild. Since then, I always stick to well-known campsites, never go alone, and always trust my instincts. Because sometimes, the real fear isn't what's out there in the dark. It's what's quietly waiting, just beyond the firelight. The summer of 2012 was supposed to be simple. I wanted a break from everything: work, the city noise, the constant buzz of screens and people. I packed my old gear, a tent I'd had since college, a small backpack with the basics, and headed out to a remote spot in the Montana wilderness. Not the usual crowded campgrounds, but a place I found on an old map, marked only as Pine Hollow. I was 28, in decent shape and confident enough to handle a solo trip. The forest was thick with towering pines, the kind that block out most of the sunlight even during the day. It felt wild, untouched, and exactly what I needed. The first day was peaceful. The air was fresh, cool, and smelled like pine needles and damp earth. I found a clearing near a small creek, set up my tent, and collected some dry wood for a fire. The sound of the creek was steady and calming, and the forest around me was alive with birds and the occasional rustle of small animals. I spent the afternoon walking along a faint trail, taking in the quiet. It felt like the world had slowed down just for me. That night, after making a simple meal on my camp stove, I sat by the fire. The flames crackled and popped, throwing flickering shadows on the trees. I kept the fire small but steady, knowing that it would keep some animals at bay and give me light if I needed it. The stars were clear and bright above, the Milky Way stretching across the sky like a thin, glowing ribbon. It was beautiful, but something about the silence made me feel oddly alone. Around midnight, I heard it. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it was too deliberate. A low, dragging sound coming from the edge of the clearing. I froze, staring into the darkness beyond the firelight. The forest was dense there, the trees growing close together, their branches tangled and thick. Whatever it was moved slowly but with purpose. The sound repeated, a soft thud, 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 like something heavy being pulled or dragged across the ground. I didn't move. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I told myself it was probably just a fallen log or a deer tangled in brush. I had no way to prove it and no reason to panic. Still, the sound didn't stop. It got closer, moving in and out of the shadows, always just beyond the fire's reach. The night air grew colder, and the crackling of the fire was the only noise besides those dragging sounds. I checked my small flashlight, keeping it close, and tried to stay calm. The forest had noises, sure, but this was different. I've camped before, alone and with friends, and this was new. After what felt like an hour but was probably only minutes, the sound stopped as suddenly as it started. The forest fell silent again. I tried to shake the feeling of unease as I crawled into my tent, zipped it shut, and pulled my sleeping bag around me. I kept my flashlight on the small flap next to my head, ready if anything else happened. Sleep was hard to come by. Every small noise, the crunch of a twig, the rustle of leaves, made me tense up, heart racing. When dawn finally came, the light was soft and pale through the thin tent fabric. I unzipped the door and stepped out into the clearing. The fire had burned down to embers overnight, cold now. I looked around for any sign of what might have made those dragging sounds. Nothing obvious. No broken branches. No animal tracks leading out of the clearing. No blood or disturbed soil. It was as if nothing had happened. I packed up quickly, feeling uneasy but not wanting to stay another night. I decided to hike back the way I came, planning to stick to the main trail this time. The forest was still quiet, but I noticed something strange. The trees along the trail had marks on their bark, long, deep scratches running up and down several of them. They looked fresh, the wood underneath still pale and raw. I stopped and examined them closely. The scratches were uneven but deep enough to look like something strong had clawed or scraped them hard. I knew bears lived in the area, but bear claw marks usually looked different, more spaced out and curved. These were rougher, less clean, and spread irregularly. I took a mental note but kept moving. A few hours later, I reached a small ridge that overlooked the valley where I had camped. From there, I could see the smoke rising faintly from the spot where my fire had been. I felt a strange mix of relief and worry. I pulled out my phone to check the signal, none. No surprise, given how remote the area was. As I started back down the trail, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. A worn piece of fabric caught on a bush branch. It looked like part of a jacket, torn and dirty. That didn't make sense. Who else could be out here, and why would they leave behind something like that? The forest had that unsettling quiet again, as if it was holding its breath. The rest of the hike back was tense. Every shadow seemed larger, every sound sharper. I kept scanning the trees for more marks or signs of movement. About halfway down, I heard a sudden snap from the bushes just off the trail. I froze, heart pounding again. I shone my flashlight toward the sound, but there was nothing there. Then I saw it. A figure moving quickly through the trees, just out of clear sight. It wasn't an animal. The shape was too tall and the movement was too deliberate. Panic surged through me. I started walking faster, then breaking into a run, pushing through branches and roots that snagged my pants. The figure stayed behind the trees, never coming fully into view, but always keeping pace. I didn't stop until I reached my car parked at the trailhead. Hands shaking, I locked the doors and started the engine. The forest was still behind me, dark and quiet again, but I didn't look back. I drove away without stopping. Later, when I got home, I looked up local reports and forums. There were mentions of illegal hunters in the area, people who hunted outside the law and sometimes tracked hikers. The scratches on the trees, the torn jacket. Maybe that was what I had stumbled upon. Someone using the forest not as a peaceful place, but as a hiding ground. The trip was supposed to be a simple break, but it became a stark reminder that the wilderness, while beautiful, holds dangers beyond the animals and weather. Sometimes the real threat is the people you don't expect. The memory of that night, the dragging sounds, the silent figure lurking just out of sight, stayed with me for years after. I never went back to Pine Hollow, and I learned to respect the wild in a way I never had before, not just for nature, but for the shadows people can cast there. I decided to spend a weekend camping alone deep in the woods of northern Minnesota in the summer of 2019. I was 26 at the time, a guy who loved solitude and the kind of silence only found far away from city noise and light pollution. The spot I picked was near a small, little-used trail that led to a lake tucked between thick pines and birches. I wanted to disconnect fully. No phone, no distractions. Just me, nature, and the quiet. I packed my gear carefully. A small but sturdy tent, a sleeping bag, a camp stove, some canned food, a flashlight with extra batteries, and a good knife. The weather forecast said clear skies, and the air smelled like fresh pine and wet earth when I arrived mid-afternoon. The ground was soft but firm, covered in layers of fallen needles and dry leaves. I found a flat spot near the edge of the lake, where the water was calm and mirrored the sky. Setting up the tent was easy enough, and I took my time making sure the stakes were secured as evening crept in. The temperature dropped quickly. I started a small fire a few feet from the tent, careful to keep it controlled and away from the dry brush. The crackling flames cast long shadows on the trees, and I cooked a simple meal of beans and rice. The stars started to come out, sharp and clear in the dark sky. I lay back on a foldable chair, the cool breeze carrying the distant sounds of insects and frogs. I had no desire to use my phone. I left it in my car, miles away. Around 10 p.m., I felt the first uneasy flicker in my gut. It wasn't fear exactly, but something like the prickling feeling you get when you know you're being watched, even though nothing is in sight. I glanced around. The forest was black except for the firelight. No animals stirred near me, no rustling or snapping twigs. Just silence. I decided to brush it off and went inside my tent to sleep. The night air was cool but not cold, and the lake's surface was still as glass. I zipped up the tent and tried to relax. I wasn't worried about bears or wolves. I'd read enough about the area to know the wildlife kept to itself if you didn't make noise. But as I lay there, I heard something, a faint noise. At first, it was a soft crunching, like footsteps on dry leaves. The kind of noise you don't expect in the dead silence of the woods at night. I froze and listened closely. The sound was slow and deliberate, coming from the direction of the trail I had walked in on earlier. It wasn't regular footsteps. It was uneven, as if the person or thing walking wasn't sure where to put their feet. The noise paused, then moved again, closer. My heart rate sped up. I turned on my flashlight and shone it out of the small mesh window in the tent. Nothing, just darkness beyond the firelight's reach. I grabbed my knife and unzipped the tent slightly to peek out. The fire was nearly out, the last few embers glowing weakly. The footsteps had stopped. My mind tried to rationalize. Maybe a deer or a raccoon, but it felt too heavy and slow for that. Suddenly, a sharp, metallic clang echoed from somewhere behind the trees. It was loud and unexpected. I sat up straight, holding the knife tightly. My flashlight beam scanned the area. Landing on nothing but shadows, I decided to stay in the tent. But sleep was impossible. The sound of quiet, irregular footsteps came and went, sometimes close, sometimes farther away. Each time I thought I heard something, I would freeze, listening for another sound or a sign of movement. Around 3 a.m., the footsteps stopped altogether. The silence that followed was deeper and heavier than before, like the forest was holding its breath. I didn't dare open the tent or move for a long time. Then, just as I began to feel the first hints of drowsiness again, a sudden sharp rustle snapped from the bushes only 10 feet away, and my flashlight slipped from my hand and landed on the tent floor with a soft thud. My breath caught. The rustling stopped. Then there was a low, slow crunching sound moving away, retreating back down the trail. I waited for what felt like hours, frozen and wide-eyed in the dark. As dawn broke, I finally felt brave enough to unzip the tent fully and step outside. The fire was cold ashes, the forest calm and normal. The trail looked untouched except for some broken twigs and a few footprints pressed into the soft earth. Footprints that weren't mine or any animals I recognized. That I packed up quickly, feeling the weight of the night pressing down on me. On the way back to my car, I kept my eyes on the trail and the woods, scanning for anything unusual. When I finally reached the parking lot and turned on my phone, I found several missed calls and messages from my sister. Worried because I hadn't checked in, I didn't say much when I got home. The experience stayed with me, the quiet terror of being watched by someone, or something that didn't want to be seen. The footprints I found weren't like any animal tracks I knew, and the sound of the metal clang still haunted me. Looking back, I think someone was out there that night, someone sneaking through the woods watching campers or hikers. Maybe a poacher or a trespasser who used the forest for illegal hunting or worse. The thought that someone could be so close and silent, stalking through the night without a word or a sign, made me realize how vulnerable you are in the wild. I haven't gone camping alone since that night. It's not fear of animals or nature I worry about. It's the people you don't see, the ones who move like shadows, quiet and deliberate, waiting in the dark. The woods are beautiful, sure, but they hide more than just trees and animals. They hide secrets, and sometimes those secrets come closer than you think. I still remember that trip like it was yesterday, even though it happened almost 10 years ago. It was the summer of 2015, and I had decided to go camping alone in the Blue Ridge Mountains. I was 26 at the time, craving some time away from the chaos of the city. I wanted silence, nature, and nothing but the stars above me. The plan was simple. Hike in for about 5 miles, find a good spot near a small creek, set up my tent, and spend 2 nights out there. No phone, no distractions, just me and the wilderness. The first day went as expected. The air was crisp and smelled of pine and earth. The trail winding through thick woods with the soft crunch of dry leaves under my boots. I kept my pack light, carrying just the essentials: water, some canned food, my sleeping bag, a flashlight, and a small first aid kit. When I finally reached the clearing by the creek, the sun was starting to dip behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. I picked a flat spot under a cluster of tall oaks and pitched my tent carefully. Making sure to secure the stakes in the rocky ground, I made a small fire, warming a can of beans and sipping from my water bottle. The creek's gentle gurgle was a soothing background sound. The birds were settling in, and the forest seemed peaceful. I lay down on my sleeping mat, staring up through the mesh of the tent at the first stars appearing. The temperature dropped fast, the chill settling into the air. I zipped up my sleeping bag tight and drifted off. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly. The silence was gone. Instead, there was a sharp, repetitive noise. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a bird or an insect, but it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. It was a low, steady tapping, almost like someone hitting a branch with a stick. I stayed still, heart pounding, trying to convince myself it was just nature. But then I heard it again, closer this time. Tap, 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 coming from the trees near my tent that I wanted to look, but the fear rooted me in place. The flashlight was in my pack, but I didn't dare reach for it. The tapping kept going, steady, unchanging. I could hear the dry leaves rustle softly with each hit. Then suddenly a heavier sound joined in. A low scraping noise, like something dragging against the tree bark. It made the hairs on my neck stand up that I told myself it must be a bear or a large animal sniffing around. But something didn't feel right. Bears usually don't tap on trees like that. The sound was too intentional, like someone was trying to get my attention, or worse, trying to scare me. My breath came out in quick, shallow gasps, and I reached slowly for my small pocket knife under my pillow. The tapping stopped as suddenly as it had started. A thick, heavy silence took over again, broken only by the distant call of an owl. I lay frozen, every nerve alert. Then, just when I thought maybe it was over, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, walking around the perimeter of my tent. The crunching of leaves, soft but unmistakable. My mind raced. Who else could be out here? The trail to my site was a long hike. No one was supposed to be here at night that I considered shouting, but my voice felt useless in the dark woods. Instead, I stayed perfectly quiet, clutching the knife, waiting for something, anything to happen. The footsteps stopped right outside the tent. Then I heard a faint breath, like someone exhaling hard. The fabric of the tent flapped slightly, and I could swear I saw a shadow move across it. Panic rose up, sharp and cold. I debated running, but I was in the middle of nowhere, and running blindly in the dark could be just as dangerous. Instead, I unzipped the tent quietly and poked my head out, flashlight in hand. The beam cut through the blackness but revealed nothing but trees, dense undergrowth, and the creek flowing quietly a few meters away that I scanned the area. My heart pounding so loud I was sure it could be heard. No movement, no sign of anyone. I stepped out cautiously, trying to see if I could find footprints or anything unusual in the dirt. The ground was dry, covered in leaves and pine needles. I couldn't see any footprints near the tent, which made no sense given the sounds I heard. That's when I noticed it. About 10 feet from my tent, lying on the ground, was a small, broken branch with fresh cuts on it. Not random breaks, but neat slices like someone had used a knife or a sharp tool. My skin crawled. It was clear now that whatever had been out there wasn't an animal. It was human. Someone had been near my tent, making noise, trying to scare me or maybe watch me. I grabbed my pack, threw everything inside, and started moving toward the trail in the dark, flashlight cutting through the forest. I didn't look back. The tapping, the footsteps, the breath. I could still hear echoes of it in my mind. I moved fast but carefully, stumbling over roots and rocks, adrenaline giving me strength I didn't know I had. After about 20 minutes of hiking, I finally reached the ranger station parking lot, where a couple of trucks were parked and lights shone. I found a park ranger and told him what happened, but he said there were no reports of anything unusual. Still, he agreed to walk me back to my car, telling me to never camp alone there again. I never did. That trip changed how I saw the woods. It wasn't scary because of monsters or ghosts. It was scary because someone else was out there, somewhere in the dark, watching and waiting. Someone who knew how to move quietly, who could get close enough to a lone camper and make them freeze with fear. That summer night in the Blue Ridge Mountains taught me that the real danger in the wilderness isn't always nature itself. It's the unknown people who hide in it. And sometimes that's enough to keep you awake forever. It was early September of 2016 when I decided to go camping alone for the first time. I was 27 then, living in Southern Oregon, working a job that kept me behind a desk most days. I'd been craving silence for weeks. Real silence, away from phones, cars, people. I picked a small, isolated campsite near the Umpqua National Forest, the kind of place with no phone service and only a thin dirt road leading in. I packed light, tent, sleeping bag, water filter, a few cans of food, flashlight, and a small hatchet. I planned to stay 2 nights. The first day was calm. The drive out took hours, with the road twisting through thick forest and endless pines closing in from both sides. The air felt heavier as I climbed higher into the hills. When I finally reached the clearing where I'd pitched the tent, the sun was already dropping low behind the trees. It wasn't an official campsite. No signs, no fire pits, just a small patch of flat ground surrounded by dense woods. The quiet hit hard the moment I stepped out of the car. No hum of power lines, no distant highway noise, just the soft sound of wind pushing through pine needles and the occasional creak of a tree shifting. I set up camp carefully, making sure the tent stakes were deep in the ground and the tarp underneath was tight. I gathered some fallen branches and built a small fire as the light faded. The smell of burning pine and smoke made me feel strangely calm. I ate a can of beans and watched the fire until it burned down to glowing orange coals. When it was fully dark, I crawled into my tent, zipped the flap, and lay there listening to the forest. The night was loud in its own way. The constant hum of crickets, distant frogs, something rustling now and then in the underbrush. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly. The forest was quieter, not silent but different. The wind had stopped completely, and the insects had gone still. The air inside the tent felt colder. I didn't hear anything specific at first, just a faint awareness that something outside had changed. Then I heard slow, heavy steps in the leaves. Not animal sounds, too controlled. They moved in a line somewhere near my campfire, circling the area. I held my breath and stayed still, straining my ears. The footsteps stopped. For a long time, there was nothing. Then I heard a dull thump, like something hitting the side of my cooler. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a bear sniffing around for food. But I'd locked everything tight and hung the bag with leftovers a good distance from camp. I waited a few more minutes, heart pounding, until I couldn't hear anything else. Eventually, the normal sounds of the forest returned. The crickets, the faint wind, and I forced myself to relax. By morning, everything looked untouched. The fire pit was the same, the cooler was still sealed, no tracks in the dirt that I could see. I tried to laugh it off, but part of me stayed tense all day. I went hiking after breakfast, following an overgrown trail behind the camp that led deeper into the forest. The trees grew tighter as I walked, and after a while, I realized I hadn't seen a single sign of other people. Not a boot print, not a cut branch, nothing. The forest floor was covered in thick moss that muffled my steps. At one point, I noticed a large tree that had been stripped of bark on one side, as if something had scraped or clawed at it. The marks were deep and uneven, too high for me to reach even with my arms stretched up. The air felt different in that spot, still, heavy, almost damp. I kept walking but turned back earlier than planned, uneasy for reasons I couldn't explain. When I got back to camp, I noticed something small but unsettling. The rope I had used to hang my food bag from a tree had been untied and dropped to the ground. The bag was gone. It wasn't shredded or torn. It was just missing, rope coiled neatly under the branch. I froze there for a minute, staring at it, trying to figure out how that could have happened. That night, I couldn't relax. I built the fire larger, hoping the light would keep anything away. The forest felt different again, darker somehow, quieter. The wind didn't move the same way it had the first night. When I finally went inside the tent, I lay with my flashlight gripped in one hand, staring at the fabric ceiling, waiting around 2 a.m. I woke again to the same slow steps, closer this time. I heard the crunch of leaves just outside the tent. My heart hammered so hard I could feel it in my throat. The light of the fire flickered faintly through the thin fabric, and I saw a shadow pass across it, tall, upright. Not a bear. The shape lingered for a moment, unmoving, then drifted out of sight. My mouth went dry, couldn't make a sound. I stayed completely still, breathing shallowly, while every muscle in my body locked tight. After what felt like forever, I heard the sound of something dragging through the dirt, then the faint crunch of footsteps fading into the trees. I didn't sleep again that night. I waited until the first hint of dawn light and stepped out of the tent. The fire had died, but the ground around it showed faint marks, boot prints. They weren't mine. They were larger, and there were several, moving in circles around the tent and then leading into the woods. My chest tightened as I followed them just far enough to see that they disappeared into the darker part of the forest where the light barely reached. I turned back, packed everything as fast as I could, and loaded it into the car I was folding the tent. I noticed something on the ground near the tree line. A small, folded piece of paper weighed down by a rock. My stomach dropped. I hesitated before picking it up. It was a page torn from a notebook, slightly damp. There were only 2 words written in messy handwriting, "Too close." I stood there for a long moment, staring at it, the forest silent around me. There was no sign of anyone nearby, no sound of movement. I didn't try to understand it. I just shoved the paper into my pocket, got in the car, and drove down that rough dirt road until the forest finally opened up to a stretch of highway. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station miles away, where my phone finally picked up a signal. Later that night, when I emptied my pockets, I unfolded that paper again. The ink had smeared slightly from sweat or rain, but the words were still clear. I threw it into the trash and watched it disappear under other scraps, but it didn't feel like it was gone. I still don't know who left it, or how long they had been watching. I've gone camping since then, but never alone. And every time I wake up in the middle of the night and the forest feels too quiet, I can't help but think about that note and how someone out there in the dark thought I was too close to something I was never supposed to find. It was late October 2016 when I decided to take a solo camping trip up in the Bitterroot Mountains of western Montana. I had been working long hours that whole year and needed a break from everything. Phones, noise, people. I wanted complete silence for a few days, just the sound of wind, water, and trees. I picked a small spot near a narrow creek, about 6 miles from the nearest trailhead. The area wasn't known for tourism, so I expected I'd have the place to myself. The first day went smooth. The trail was covered in red and yellow leaves, and the air had that sharp chill that comes with late fall. I had packed light, just a tent, sleeping bag, food, and some gear. By evening, I had my camp set up beside the creek. The sun dropped fast behind the ridge, and the air turned colder than I expected. I built a small fire and sat close, listening to the distant rustle of trees. Everything felt right. The silence out there was deep, the kind that presses against your ears until you start hearing your own heartbeat. Around midnight, I woke up to a faint snapping sound outside my tent. It wasn't loud, but sharp enough to cut through the quiet. It sounded like a branch breaking under something's weight. I froze and just listened. Another snap followed, closer this time. I thought maybe it was a deer moving through the woods, or maybe a raccoon. I waited a few minutes, then the sound faded. I told myself it was nothing and went back to sleep, though it took a long time before I actually drifted off again. The next morning, I stepped out and looked around. There were no signs of animals near camp, no tracks in the soft dirt. The air smelled clean like wet pine. I hiked up a ridge about a mile north to get a better view of the valley. From the top, I could see layers of forest stretching for miles, just endless green and brown ridges folding into each other. When I got back to camp that afternoon, I noticed something strange. A small stack of rocks had been made near the creek, maybe 20 feet from my tent. 3 flat stones balanced neatly on top of each other. I didn't remember seeing them the day before. I figured maybe they were already there and I just hadn't noticed. Still, something about them looked too clean, too freshly placed. I kicked the pile over and forgot about it.by nightfall. Clouds rolled in. The air grew damp and I could smell rain. I built another fire, ate, and sat for a while, watching the flames twist and drop as the wood burned down. Eventually, I crawled into my tent and zipped up. The rain started just after midnight, soft at first, then heavier. The sound against the fabric made it hard to hear anything else. I must have fallen asleep sometime after 1. When I woke up again, the rain had stopped, but something felt off. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. No birds, no wind, no water sounds. I sat up and checked my watch. It was just past 6. I unzipped the tent and stepped out. My fire pit was cold and soaked from the rain, but the strange thing was the ground around my tent. There were footprints in the mud, not animal tracks, shoe prints, human ones. They circled my tent once and led off toward the trees. They were faint but visible, like someone had walked there during the night after the rain started. My stomach dropped when I realized I hadn't heard anything through the rain. Whoever it was must have been close. Right outside while I was sleeping. I followed the prints a little way into the woods. They faded quickly where the ground was drier. I stopped when I lost them and just stood there, scanning the trees. Everything looked normal, just wet leaves and dark trunks. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was nearby. I went back to camp and packed my food into my dry bag, then sat for a long time trying to calm down. I told myself it could have been a hunter passing through, someone just curious about my tent. Still, the idea of a stranger walking around my camp in the dark didn't sit right. That day, I didn't hike far. I stayed close, gathering wood and keeping busy, but my mind wouldn't stop replaying those footprints. Every small sound, the crack of a branch, the movement of leaves, made me tense. When night came again, I didn't make a fire. I didn't want to draw attention. I sat in my tent, light off, listening to the steady flow of the creek. Around 1 in the morning, I heard it again, the faint snap of a stick, then the sound of slow, steady steps. My heartbeat felt loud in my chest. The steps stopped for a few seconds, then started again, closer. Whoever it was moved around the edge of the clearing. I didn't breathe. After what felt like forever, the sound faded away, disappearing into the trees. That I didn't sleep after that. I stayed awake, sitting upright, until the first gray light of morning started to seep through the tent fabric. When I finally unzipped it, I saw something that made my stomach turn. In the mud near the creek, someone had stacked more rocks, this time 5, perfectly balanced. And in the middle of the stack, placed carefully on top, was one of my tent stakes. It was one I must have left out near the fire pit. The metal was muddy, but I knew it was mine. That was it for me. I packed everything as fast as I could. My hands were shaking so bad I kept dropping things. I didn't bother to eat or clean up. I just shoved everything into my pack, slung it over my shoulders, and started back toward the trailhead. The forest felt different on the way out, heavier somehow, like it was pressing in closer. I kept checking over my shoulder, certain I'd see someone following. But the woods stayed empty. It took me almost 3 hours to reach my car. When I finally got there, I tossed my pack into the back and locked the doors immediately. I sat there for a long time, just breathing. Before starting the engine, I looked back down the trail. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, wet from the rain, dark and quiet. Nothing moved, but I still felt watched, like eyes were somewhere deep between the trunks, just out of sight. I drove straight home and didn't stop until I reached my driveway. When I unpacked later that night, I noticed something that made my skin crawl again. One of my socks was missing from the bag I'd packed it in. I didn't drop it. I knew I hadn't. I'd packed everything carefully before leaving. I never went back to that part of Montana again. I still camp, but never alone, and never without checking for footprints every morning. I try not to think about it, but sometimes when I lie in bed at night and hear the wind or the sound of rain outside, I remember the quiet steps circling my tent, the rocks by the creek, and the feeling of someone standing there in the dark, waiting while I slept. It was the summer of 2019 when I decided to go camping alone for the first time. I had always gone with friends before, but this time I wanted peace. No noise, no talking, no one to depend on. Just the woods, my tent, and me. I chose a place called Gray Hollow, a thick forest in northern Oregon that wasn't very popular anymore. Most people went to the larger national parks nearby, so Gray Hollow had turned quiet over the years. I liked that. The fewer people around, the better. I wanted to feel cut off from everything, like I was in a different world. That I parked my car at the end of a dirt road around noon. The air smelled like pine and soil, and the sky was a bright, cloudless blue. The trail into the forest was narrow and uneven, mostly covered with leaves and fallen branches. My backpack was heavy with supplies: food, a small gas stove, water, a sleeping bag, a hatchet, and a flashlight. I also brought a small folding knife that I kept in my pocket just in case. The first few hours of the hike were calm. I barely heard anything except the crunch of leaves under my boots and the occasional bird call. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. The trees grew taller and closer together, and sunlight filtered through in small patches. I passed a dried-up stream and a few old fire pits, probably left from campers years ago. It felt like no one had been there in a long time. After hiking for about 2 hours, I found a small clearing that looked perfect for camping. It was surrounded by trees on all sides, with a soft layer of grass and enough flat space to set up my tent. I dropped my backpack and started unpacking. I hammered the tent stakes into the ground, set up my sleeping bag, and arranged my supplies in neat piles. Then I gathered dry wood for a small campfire before sunset. As the light started to fade, the forest changed. The birds went quiet, and the air cooled down fast. The shadows stretched longer, and everything seemed to slow down. I lit my campfire and boiled some canned soup over it. The crackling sound of the fire was comforting, but there was something strange about how silent everything else was. Usually, even in remote places, you can hear insects or owls or something, but there was nothing, just stillness. When darkness fully set in, I sat by the fire and stared into the flames. I felt tired but couldn't shake off a weird uneasiness. Every now and then I thought I heard faint noises, like light footsteps in the distance, or twigs snapping somewhere deep in the trees. I kept telling myself it was just animals, but it didn't sound like that. The sounds were too spaced out, too slow, almost like someone trying to move quietly. I tried not to think about it. Around 10 p.m., the fire was burning low, and I crawled into my tent. I zipped it up, switched off my flashlight, and tried to sleep. For a while, I lay still, listening. The silence outside was heavy. Then I heard something. It was soft at first, a dragging sound, like something brushing against the ground. I froze. It came from behind the tent, slow and deliberate, moving in small steps. My heart started to pound so hard I could hear it in my ears. I stayed completely still, holding my breath, hoping it would pass. The sound circled halfway around the tent and stopped. I could hear the faint rustling of grass. Then a few seconds later, something tapped lightly against the tent fabric. Just once, near my feet. I didn't move. I wanted to look, but the thought of unzipping the tent made my stomach twist. I waited, listening, but the sound didn't come again. That I don't know how long I stayed awake after that. I kept my flashlight in my hand, ready to turn it on, but I never did. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a light, uneasy sleep. When I woke up, it was early morning. The light coming through the tent was gray and weak. I slowly unzipped the door and looked outside. Everything looked normal, but when I stepped out, I noticed something strange. The ground around my tent had faint marks, like shallow footprints, not animal prints, but human. They were light but clear enough to see. Whoever or whatever had walked there had circled my tent once. Maybe twice. I tried to calm myself, thinking maybe it was an illusion, shadows from branches, or my imagination running wild. I ate a quick breakfast, packed up my gear, and decided to move deeper into the forest, away from the clearing. I wanted to find a spot near a small creek I'd seen on the map earlier. Maybe being near running water would make me feel safer. It took me a few hours to find it. The creek was narrow but clean, with cold water flowing over smooth stones. I set up camp again, built another fire, and sat there trying to relax. The day passed quietly. I even convinced myself that maybe the footprints were mine from the night before. Maybe I'd walked around the tent without realizing it. But that night, everything came back. Around midnight, I woke up to the faint sound of splashing in the creek. It wasn't steady like an animal drinking or moving through it. It was slow, 2 steps, pause, 2 more steps. Then silence. I felt my chest tighten. I turned off my flashlight and listened, every muscle tense. The sound came again, this time closer to the bank. Then I heard the unmistakable crunch of leaves being stepped on. Someone was walking on the edge of the campsite. The steps stopped near the fire pit. I could hear shallow breathing, not loud, but close. Too close. My heart raced. I slowly reached for the knife in my pocket, gripping it tight. The footsteps began to move again, circling around just like before. Then something brushed against the side of the tent. My hand was shaking so bad I could barely hold the knife. That I finally decided I couldn't just lie there again. I took a deep breath, unzipped the tent as quietly as I could, and shined my flashlight outside. The beam cut through the darkness, lighting up the trees, the creek, the ground. But there was no one there, only my backpack, the fire ashes, and a few footprints leading into the woods. They were fresh. I didn't wait to think. I grabbed my bag, stuffed everything I could inside, and started walking fast through the woods. I didn't follow the trail. I just kept moving toward where I thought the car was. My hands were shaking, my eyes darting around every few seconds, trying to see if someone was behind me. It felt like forever. But eventually, I reached the dirt road again. The sight of my car sitting there felt unreal. I threw everything inside, started the engine, and drove off without looking back once. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest gas station about 30 miles away. When I stepped out to fill the tank, I finally looked at myself in the mirror of the car. I looked pale, drained, like I hadn't slept in days. My hands were dirty, and there were scratches on my arms from running through the brush. I never went back to Gray Hollow again. For a long time after that, I couldn't even think about camping. I don't know who was out there those nights. Maybe someone living in the woods, maybe someone following me for reasons I'll never understand. But I know this much. Whoever it was, they never wanted me to see them. They just wanted me to know they were there. And that thought still keeps me awake sometimes, long after I've left the woods behind.